Now we'll start day 2 of the symposium, and we will have 4 speakers this morning, 2 talks now, and then a coffee break, and then 2 more talks. And in each of these sub-sessions, we will have 1 speaker from academia and 1 from company. And we will start right now with Gilles Louppe from University of Liège, who will talk about how to invert images, scientific images. So thank you.
All right. So good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Okay, so my goal this morning will be to give you a brief overview of what we've been doing in my group and how we can use deep learning and generative model specifically to solve inverse problems in science. We'll look at 3 different scales of inverse problems. First, from low, I would say low-dimensional inverse problems related to exoplanets. And then we'll cramp up the scale. We'll consider a larger problem in oceanography. And finally, we'll consider what I would call an extra-large inverse problem from weather science. And so this talk will echo many of the things we've discussed yesterday, and specifically Lauren's talk. So many of the things that I will explain are quite similar, so it's your chance to connect the dots. All right. So as a starting example, imagine that we have a noisy observation Y, like the one that you see in the background of the slide. And this observation is the observation of some underlying physical process that you are interested in. Okay? So for example, this observation could be a low-resolution satellite image of the atmosphere. It could be a noisy medical scan, or it could be simply a photograph that you take in low light conditions. And so our goal today will be quite simple. Given this noisy and low-resolution image, can we recover all plausible physical states, X, that could have caused, that could have led to this particular observation? And so, for instance, again, if Y is a sparse and, let's say, resolution-limited satellite image of the atmosphere, can we recover all high-resolution estimate of the full 3D volume of the atmosphere that would be then consistent with this observation? And so this is one version of the problem, but we can go one level higher if, in addition, we have also a good understanding of the physics. And so if we can also write down a mathematical model of that physical process or a computer program that instantiates this physical process. And in this model, we relate the state X to fundamental parameters, model parameters theta. Then a variation of our problem, of the inverse problem, will be to try to infer the parameters, the model parameters theta, that would best explain the final observation. All right? So these inverse problems are quite common in science because the experimental measurements, they are neither direct nor perfect. So we have to deal with instrumental noise, with limited resolution, with incomplete or indirect observations. And so because of that, we have to the only thing we can do is to guess the underlying physical state or the model parameters that could have led to these final observations. Okay? And not only we want to do that, we also want to quantify the uncertainty that we would have in our estimates. And so formally, what we want to, so we can frame that as a Bayesian inference problem, and our goal will be to try to estimate the posterior distribution Px given Y. So the posterior distribution of the latent states, the state that we can't directly observe given an observation Y, or the posterior distribution over the model parameters theta given that same observation. Okay, so this is the setting. So why is this a difficult problem, you might ask? Well, the first reason is that the computer models and the simulators you all have in your scientific domains, they are very often expressed as forward processes which implement causal mechanistic assumption about the physical process or the data acquisition process itself, like you can also have model of the instrument itself. And in this form, they are very convenient to generate data, to generate synthetic data, but they are not so useful when it comes to inversion. Okay, so you cannot go back from observation to state or model parameters. You cannot reverse them easily. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that this problem is ill-posed. There are many solutions. There is not very often not just one solution, one latent state X or one parameter value which is compatible with the data, there is a whole set usually of states or model parameters. Okay, and we want to infer all of them and quantify our uncertainty that we have about them. All right, so the first problem I will consider is what I would classify as a low-dimensional inverse problem, where we have in the order of a few tens of model parameters. And so this would be so you could say, right, this is the same as classical model fitting, and I can just do MCMC or even just do maximum likelihood estimation, and you would be right. But very often, what will happen? Very often, what can happen is that you don't have access to the density. Okay, for this algorithm to work, you need to be able to evaluate the density of X given model parameters, but this is not always possible. Okay, and because of this, you can't just call MCMC or do maximum likelihood estimation. All right, so the example I will take is the case of exoplanet atmosphere characterization. This is some work we have done with one of my PhD students and an astronomer from the University of Liège. And so what happens with exoplanets is that when it transits in front of its star, a tiny fraction of the starlight actually passes through the atmosphere of the planet. And if we analyze the spectrum of this light, then we can actually infer a lot about the composition and the properties of this planet or of its atmosphere. And so this is quite important for astronomers because if you understand the atmosphere of a planet, then that tells you a lot, or that can tell you a lot about the formation of the planet, its evolution, and also its potential for habitability. The object that we studied is this little cluster of pixels that you see in the middle. It's actually not an exoplanet, it's a brown dwarf. It goes under the name of WISE 1738. And it's located 25 light years away from the Earth. It was recently observed again by the JWST telescope, and that provided us with a high-quality spectrum of its atmosphere. Okay? And this brown dwarf specifically is interesting because its temperature is similar to that of some exoplanets, which makes it a good proxy for studying exoplanet atmospheres. And it's also interesting because it's cold enough to have complex molecules like water vapor, methane, and ammonia. All right, so how do we analyze the spectrum? Well, what we use is an algorithm from the family of simulation-based inference algorithm, which is called neural posterior estimation, or NPE for short. So NPE usually uses, and this is what we use too, a normalizing flow, which is a type of deep generative model to approximate directly the posterior distribution, in this case of atmospheric parameters theta, given an observed spectrum X. And how do we make this happen? Well, it's quite simple. What you do is that you train a normalizing flow on pairs of model parameters and synthetic spectrum, which you obtain by just simulating from a physical model, in this case of exoplanet atmospheres. And once you have trained this normalizing flow, then you can just inject the actual spectrum that you observe as input to the normalizing flow and obtain directly in just one forward pass through the network the entire posterior distribution, or at least an approximation of that distribution. So this is what we did, and which we applied to that observation. And you see there in this slide some of the results of this analysis. On the left panel, what you see in black is the spectrum which was measured by the telescope in black. And what you see in blue is the best fit that we can obtain from the posterior. And you see that in this case, the model fits the data quite well. It captures the main features. It's not perfect, but also this is just one realization out of the posterior. We could have looked also at the entire posterior predictive distribution. What is more interesting for the science is the right panel, which shows the posterior distribution of the atmospheric parameters, which are compatible jointly with this observation. And so this can look quite intimidating, and actually it's not the entire posterior plot. We've not included all the variables. But this is actually telling us a lot about the physics and the chemistry of this world. So for example, from this posterior distribution, we can conclude that the atmosphere of this brown dwarf contains water vapor, methane, ammonia, also carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. And the presence of these two molecules actually was quite a surprise. So the detection of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, because these molecules were not expected to be present in such a cold atmosphere, which suggests that there is non-equilibrium chemistry at play. So basically stuff from the surface or from below is bubbling up into the atmosphere. Okay? And so in turn, this disequilibrium chemistry tells us a lot about atmospheric mixing, about transport processes, which have shaped the evolution of this object. So of course there is much more to say, and I invite you to check out the study if you're interested in that. My point mainly today is to highlight that we can obtain all this scientific insight because of our ability to perform a Bayesian inference problem without making any compromise on the forward processes. Okay? We actually implement everything, all the physics we believe about the system in the forward process, and then we invert it. Even though this process can be quite complex, non-linear, high-dimensional, this is not an issue. All right, now let's move on to the second part when we increase the size of the inference problem. So let's say now we want to solve this problem where the dimension, let's say of the state, given of the state X is in the thousands or the tens of thousands of dimensions. So we could think that, okay, you apply the same recipe, train a normalizing flow. However, because of the architecture of a normalizing flow and the fact that we need the architecture to be invertible, this will quickly become a bottleneck to reach good results. And so we cannot apply simply normalizing flow to problem of this size. We need something else. We need stronger deep generative models. Fortunately, as you are all aware, the deep learning community has been very active in the development of deep generative models, with diffusion models really taking the spotlight in recent years when it comes to modeling very high-dimensional data distributions. So this is precisely the tool that we'll use also to solve these inverse problems. All right, so for a quick recap about diffusion models, they are a class of deep generative models that you can use to learn, use to generate data, and it works by reversing a gradual noising process. So the forward process, which you see there, progressively add noise to the data until it becomes pure noise. Okay, so mathematically, this is quite simple and elegant. We can define this process as a stochastic differential equation, an SDE, which corresponds to a diffusion process, a classical diffusion process. What is even nicer is that the time reverse process, so the diffusion process that we would be running backward, can also be described analytically by an SDE, which is the equation that you see above, which means that we can use that to generate data. And the recipe that we can use is that we can just draw pure noise samples, usually from a Gaussian distribution, and then run the reverse SDE or run the SDE backward through time. And at each step, what we would be doing would be to remove noise in the sample until we obtain a data sample in which there is no noise, in which there is only data. Okay? There is an important quantity in this equation, which is what we call the score function, which is the gradient of the log density of the perturbed data, xt at time t. This is really the key that we need if you want to run this SD or this reverse SD. All right? But unfortunately, for most interesting problem, we don't have access to this quantity. We don't know the score. Okay? And so what we need to do is to approximate it. And this is something that we can do with the neural network. And what we can do, what is usually done, is that we train a neural network D, usually a denoiser, which we will use to approximate this score function. And we train this denoiser by minimizing a denoising score function, the one that you see in the middle of the slide. And so very intuitively, what we do is that we train a neural network. and the neural network takes as input a noisy version of the data, the one that we produce with the diffusion process, together with the time step, and we ask this network to recover the clean version of that input. Okay, and we train this network to do that at all level of noise t. And what happens is that we can show that the optimal denoiser, the optimal neural network, is the mean or the expected value of x given xt. Okay, and this quantity is quite nice because you can relate it to the score function that we need through via this formula. Okay, so from this optimal output, so if we have the optimal denoiser, we know that the output will be this expectation, and then we can relate it to the score that we need. Okay, so once we have a good approximation of the score, then if we want to generate data, we just take the denoiser output, we transform it into an approximation of the score, we plug it inside the reverse SD, and then we run it backward through time. All right, so now that we have a basic understanding of diffusion model, let's see, of course, how we can use them to solve inverse problems. So the most straightforward approach would be simply to hardwire the conditioning information, the observation Y, directly as an additional input to the network. So we could take this architecture and add a third input, which directly would correspond to the observation, and we would be done. Okay? This would work under the assumption, of course, that we have access to many pairs of states and outputs. Okay? But this is very often not the case. We may have data or latent state X on the one hand, we may have observation Y on the other hand, but we don't have paired data necessarily, or we don't know in advance what will be the observation model. This is something that can change maybe with time. So for example, if the dynamics of your instrument fluctuates with time, you will have to upgrade or to update the observation model with the current condition of the instrument. And so there is no way, it would not be convenient to retrain this denoiser every day to account for the change in the instrument. So an alternative approach is to notice that the posterior distribution that we are after can be re-expressed using Bayes' rule as the likelihood and the prior. Okay? And the score version of the Bayes theorem also holds, and it will allow us to re-express the score of the posterior distribution, which is the distribution we would like to sample from, as the sum of the prior score, which is a quantity that supposedly we already have. This is the diffusion model we would have trained a priori. And the second term, which is the score of the likelihood, or in this case, of the likelihood corresponding to the perturbed state, to the noisy state xt. So this term is a bit more complicated to estimate. So there are various algorithms that have been proposed to approximate this term. Laurence talked about that yesterday. I will not go into the details. You can just assume that we can approximate that more or less well. And once you have a good approximation, then you plug these two scores together and you feed that, you replace the score in the reverse SD with this composition, and then you would be sampling effectively from the posterior distribution. Right? So this is quite nice because this trick enables what we call zero-shot sampling. So you can take a pre-trained diffusion prior, and then you can sample conditionally on external variables Y, conditionally on observations, without having to hardwire the architecture of this neural network. Okay, so an example of such large inverse problem is something that we've been working on with a PhD student from my team and an oceanographer, again, from the University of Liège. And the problem that we've been trying to answer is whether or not we could nowcast the hypoxia events in the Black Sea only from satellite observations. Okay? So the Black Sea is a large inland sea between the Eastern Europe and Western Asia. It's a quite unique ecosystem with a strong stratification that leads to anoxic conditions below 200 meters of depth, which makes it actually a good laboratory to study hypoxia, which is really a growing problem in many coastal areas worldwide due to climate change and also due to nutrient pollutions and other factors. And so understanding how these zones of hypoxia evolve or could actually inform early warning systems and also ecosystem management strategies. And so in collaboration with oceanographer, we've been trying to map the 3D oxygen concentration in the Black Sea from satellite observations only. So what we want is to basically infer the oxygen concentration at the surface, but also in the volume below at every level of that. Okay? And so this is quite a challenging problem because high resolution is needed for this to be useful. The first reason is that the oxygen depletion patterns, they follow the complex bathymetry, so the geometry of the seafloor, and the circulation. And so if we miss the small scale features, then we actually miss also the physics of hypoxia. And second, for this to be something that you can notice from satellite observation, we need high resolution images. So we need, for example, in this case, at least 1 kilometer resolution observations. They are enough to detect, as you see there in the image, phytoplankton blooms and fronds, which you can relate to oxygen levels. And if we were to use, for example, instead 25 kilometer resolution, then these would be completely smoothed out and would not be able to infer anything meaningful. All right, so fortunately, good enough physical model of the Black Sea exists, and we can use them to produce reanalysis data from which we can train a diffusion prior of realistic 3D oceanic states in this case. That includes physical variable of interest like temperature, salinity, and more specifically for us, the concentration of oxygen. So our preliminary results, they show that we can recover realistic 3D oxygen maps from satellite observation only, which is quite interesting, but of course more work is needed to validate this result and to improve the model. So this is just a work in progress, but this, I think, was a good example of a high-dimensional inverse problem that really require high resolution. All right, what if we scale up further the dimension of our inverse problem? What if we consider an extra large inverse problem where we have more than 10 to the 6 dimensions, and maybe more if you want? And so, of course, the goal is not only to solve large inverse problem. Why do we need large inverse problem in science? It's because as we increase the resolution of the process that we consider in order to account for small-scale physics or to for this model to be more faithful, then necessarily the dimension of the system will increase. Okay? And if we were to apply directly a diffusion model on data of this dimension, this also would fail, or it would be quite difficult to obtain good results. The denoiser network that we would need would be enormous in order to produce good data. And so to illustrate these challenges, I will describe the largest problem we have considered in our group, which is the problem of trying to reconstruct past atmospheric state from satellite observations. Okay, so from an inverse problem perspective, what we effectively want to do is to start from a trajectory or an history of satellite measurements and to retrieve a video of the evolution of the atmosphere. Okay, but not only we are interested, we are not really interested by just recovering one video that would be compatible with the observation. What we want is to infer all of them. Okay, we want to recover a distribution over these videos of atmospheric trajectories and to quantify, of course, the uncertainty in our reconstructions. And third, can we do that at the scale of the entire Earth? So can we do that for the entire Earth system? And so formally, this is not a new problem. This is an inverse problem which is known as data assimilation in atmospheric science. And so formally, what we have is that we now assume that the system or the physical process that we are considering evolves through time, okay, according to a transition model, P of xt plus 1 given xt, okay, and that this system is not directly observed, okay, but it's observed only indirectly through observations. And so we have then an observation model that relates the current state to the observations. And then what we want to do, the goal of data assimilation, is to estimate plausible trajectories, so a sequence of consecutive states, x1 to L, given an observation. And that, again, can be expressed using Bayes' rule through the components that we have as a prior over the state trajectories, which itself can be decomposed as a prior over the initial state, and then the transitions from one state to the next, and then the observations y that we relate to the states. So why is this an important problem to solve? Because if we can solve data assimilation, then that can help us understand past atmospheric state, which is critical for climate science. But also, it's something that you need if you want to do weather forecasting. If you want to forecast the future, you need to know the current state of the system. And the only way you can know the current state of the system is by solving this data assimilation problem in the first place. Okay, so the strategy that we propose to tackle this problem is called score-based data assimilation. It really follows the same strategy as before. First, we build a diffusion model of, in this case, trajectories of the system. We had to make a few tricks such that we can generate trajectories of any length. It's not something that we fix. And then second, once we have this prior over state trajectories, then we can use zero-shot posterior sampling algorithm, whatever flavor you want to use, to sample trajectory which would be consistent with the observations. So to illustrate this, let's consider this example, which is a toy example of a 2D turbulent flow, which we don't directly observe. We only observe the system from noisy, incomplete, and coarse-grained observations. So the top row would show you a ground truth trajectory of this fluid. Then the second row that you see there would be observations that we have about the system. So you see that we don't have observations at every step. We only have observation at the first, the fourth, and the seventh step. We don't observe the entire field. And when we observe something, we don't observe it we only observe it at a low resolution. You see pixels in the Y row that you don't see in the upper row. And so the goal then is, given this observation, can we recover trajectories of the system which would be consistent with the Y values? And so we can train a diffusion prior on state trajectories, do zero-shot posterior sampling, and then recover now trajectories. So we obtain a posterior distribution of our trajectories of the entire evolution of the system. What you should see is that these trajectories, they are consistent with the ground truth. At least they are consistent in the middle part, because this is the middle part which is constrained by the observations. You should notice variations at the boundary when you compare that to the ground truth. But when it comes to the middle part, since they are constrained by the observations, you would see consistency. Okay, so this was a nice proof of concept, which we worked on 2 years ago already. And then what we set for ourselves was the following question. Can we actually scale this approach to the entire Earth system? So if we want to capture the complexity of the atmosphere, then we need to work at very high resolution. And we need to account for many variables. So if, for example, we want to work at 0.25 degree resolution, if you want to account for 6 atmospheric variables with 13 pressure levels, hourly time steps, and we want to produce trajectories of 14 days, then if we add up all these numbers together, then we would have in the order of 10 to the 9 or 10 to the 10 variables that we would need to infer. Okay, so that would be the dimension of our inverse problem. All right, so this is, of course, orders of magnitude larger than what current diffusion model can handle directly in data space. So we need, again, a new tool, or at least a variation of the tools we have used to solve this problem. What we studied recently is the case of latent diffusion models for physics simulation. And so the idea is quite simple. It's very similar to what is done to generate these videos from text. you can apply the same principle to generate or to emulate dynamical system. And the trick is to not directly operate in the data space, but instead to compress, to encode the state X into a latent space. Okay, so this is the usual, of course, recipe in deep learning. When there is a challenge, you just you just add more layers, you add one layer of abstraction, and this is exactly the same idea here. You compress the data, it becomes smaller, and then you train a diffusion model over compressed states. Okay, you train a diffusion model to reproduce trajectory of compressed states. And what we discovered in a recent paper is that this latent diffusion model, they remain quite accurate. So you see a video comparing some ground truth simulation and the one that we emulate, even with very high compression rates. So this is the approach that we have used recently in an update of a model we've been working on, which we have called APA. And so APA is a weather model based on a latent diffusion model. So we have first an autoencoder, a 500 million parameter autoencoder that compresses the data from the data space into a latent space with a compression factor a bit below 500. Then we have a 1 billion parameter latent diffusion model that generates trajectories in this latent space, which we then decode back into the data space with a decoder. And finally, we can combine this model, this latent diffusion model, with a posterior sampling algorithm to solve the data assimilation problem, which is, in this case, a problem of estimating the posterior distribution of the compressed atmospheric state given some observation. And so this is one set of results where we apply our model to do reanalysis. So we start from an history of observation, a sequence of observation, and we recover trajectories, past trajectories of the system that are consistent with these observations. And so in the first and fourth row, you see 6 variables that correspond to ground truth. So these are trajectories in the form of videos. In the second and the fifth row, you see observations that we have used to condition the model. So on the second row, you see weather station measurements at the surface level. And in the fifth row, you see these bands which correspond to satellite observations. And then in the third and the last row, you see a realization that we sampled from the posterior. And you should see, at least it's quite difficult to spot differences, that it agrees quite well with the ground truth distribution. All right, so this morning I added one more slide because of some of the questions that we had yesterday. I think it's an interesting trick which also relates to what I've been talking. What if we can't train this new model in order to do data assimilation? Can't we maybe just reuse, recycle pre-trained models that are already there, that have been released? Can't we also use them to solve the same data assimilation problem? So can we condition the forecast on extra observations? And this is actually possible if we reuse the same trick as before. So the score decomposition can be used to turn autoregressive weather model, which usually takes the current state of the system, which has been produced by classical approaches of data assimilation, and then just produce trajectories onward. So we can turn this autoregressive model into what we call optimal proposal distribution, which in this case would sample the next state given the current state and the observations that we may have or that we have already for that next state. Okay? We can do that because we have the prior, which in this case is this transition model, and we know the relationship between the state and the observation, so we can combine the two. And now that we have an approximation, now that we can sample from this distribution, we can plug that into a particle filtering algorithm and actually do online data assimilation with a pre-trained model. And so this is what we have done in a recent paper, which will be soon on the archive, where you see so in the plot, in red, you see a forecast of GenCast, which is initialized at some state. And of course, it will diverge from the ground truth trajectory eventually. Okay, there is no surprise about that. However, if you do the forecasting, conditioning, or observations that you may have for this time step, then it will remain close to the actual ground truth trajectory. And what you see there below are ensemble means, the ground truth above, the ensemble mean forecast for GenCast in the third row, and in the middle, the one you would obtain by just sampling conditionally and doing this particle filtering data assimilation process. Okay, so this is still GenCast, but just GenCast, which we enhance with this trick of conditioning to the observations. All right, so in conclusion, my main message today is to say that deep generative models, they unlock high-dimensional Bayesian inference problem in complex physical models without making any compromise about the complexity and the science that you want to put in this model. And really, in my opinion, this should unlock new scientific questions that previously were not possible because of the sheer size of the problem they would induce. Okay? Of course, many challenges remain. The first one is the validation. In everything I've talked so far, what you obtain are approximations for the posterior. They can be quite far off from the target that we want to approximate. So understanding when and why this method works is an important question, even more important at those scales, and even more challenging. The resolution, so can we increase further the resolution and still solve inverse problem? And finally, misspecification, which was also mentioned by Laurence yesterday. What if the prior, the physical model or the observation model are known to be wrong or incomplete? Can we also learn them? It's something which is still open as a question. All right, so let me finally thank my PhD student, without whom none of this work would have been possible. Thank you.
Now we have our second speaker for the morning, and we have Stefan Leichenauer from SandboxAQ, who is going to talk about large quantitative models as engines for science. And I guess you are Vice President for Engineering and lead scientist at this company, right? Based in the US.
That's right. Yeah, based in the US, and happy to be here. This is my first time in Sweden, actually. Came here from Texas, where I live. It's really nice, and thank you for having me. Thank you to the organizers. This talk is going to be a little bit different from most of the talks here at this conference. I think it'll probably be the least technical talk. I don't think I even have any equations on any of the slides. But why is that? I think one of what I could have done, I could have given a presentation, an academic style presentation on, say, one of the papers that we have put out at Sandbox. But I think I can give maybe a more unique contribution to this conference by giving you sort of a higher level, slightly higher level perspective on a lot of the questions that we're talking about from the perspective of a, mid-sized startup company, SandboxAQ, which is not a research organization, right? Our job is not to produce papers. It's not really to do research. We have a strong science undercurrent in a lot of what we do. But our goal is to make software products that solve problems for our customers. And I think because of that, I think a better use of these 20 or so minutes is to give you a little bit of the perspective of how we talk about the work that we do. I'll highlight some of the work that we've done and show you, I guess, the kinds of things that the kinds of issues that come up when we're solving the kinds of problems we're solving in industry. And so, what do I mean by that? Let me say a few words about SandboxAQ. So we're an AI-first company. We spun out of Google about 3.5 years ago, a little more than 3.5 years ago. And certainly a lot has happened since then. A lot has happened, say, in the world of AI since then. And the kinds of products that we're producing, the kinds of customers that we have are big enterprise customers in a lot of different domains. The one that I'll give as an example here and we'll get to is the main example will be in pharmaceuticals and drug discovery and chemistry slightly more generally, which I think hasn't been talked about too much yet at this conference, which is nice. But we work on things a little bit more general than that. And in the world where we're coming from, where we are operating in Sandbox, where most of the people that I talk to day to day are these folks at these large enterprises who have lots of problems that they're trying to solve using AI. What does AI mean for these people, for this audience of people, especially in the last 3 years? Well, AI means large language models, and it means ChatGPT. And so that's kind of where the story begins when we're trying to talk about how we think about AI, and we'll come back around to AI for science in a few slides. So it's now 3 years, almost 3 years post ChatGPT. And if you've not seen this kind of graph before, this is something called the Gartner hype curve. And it tells you how, especially from an industry perspective, how you should think about emerging technologies. And most of the technologies that we like to talk about, the things that are very exciting for us, are on this early side of the hype curve where innovation is happening, okay? And many people would say that foundation models right now, led by these large language models being applied to all kinds of problems, are kind of at the peak of the hype curve where there's a lot of excitement about it. And maybe if you look if you read news articles and so forth, you will notice that there's now a trend toward going from lots and lots of endless hype about these things, and now we're starting to see more and more people talk about the downsides and how they can't solve every problem. And that's sort of where we like to come in at SandboxAQ and say, yes, of course, and I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to resonate with you all. Something like ChatGPT can't solve every problem, right? There's a reason why at all of the talks we've had and are having at this conference, the answer is not, well, let's just ask ChatGPT what the weather is going to be, right? For example, there are other things that we do. And so really the theme, and I think the theme of this conference and the theme of a lot of what AI has been and a lot of what it will be going forward is that, well, there's some very exciting things happening on the surface that, most people out in the real world is all that they pay attention to, things like LLMs and AI agents coming up. But then there's a whole bunch of other stuff underneath the surface. And there's just a few things here, but basically all of the tools in the toolboxes that we've been talking about at this gathering are kind of under the surface from this point of view. And one that I want to highlight that we view as very important at SandboxAQ is this one at the bottom, which is not even, from one point of view, it's not even an AI tool. It's simulation, old-fashioned simulation, solving equations, things that you would categorize, in something like high-performance computing, for example. And when you take all of these kinds of tools, and especially the simulation tool at the bottom, you can apply these tools, including, and LLMs are great, they should be part of it too. Apply these tools to all kinds of different domains, the kind of domains, the science domains that we all in this room know and love. And this is, this collection of tools applied to these problems. This is what we like to talk about as LQMs, large quantitative models. And mostly this is a way of talking about it to folks who, who are mostly living at the surface level. I think, in a sense, a lot of what I hope I'm saying is resonating with you folks, even if you're not using the same language of LQMs. And of course, I'm not the only one saying this. You all would agree, I think. And there's been a lot of talk recently, as I mentioned, about how the next people talk about even at this surface level, the next waves of AI. What is missing? What do we need to add? And a lot of it has to do with, well, the behavior of the real world, right? It's not just what's written on the internet. It's how does the real world behave? And so the general problem that we're all trying to solve is how to insert that into our models in the best way. Okay, and so this is kind of an advertisement slide that I would give at a gathering, at like an industry gathering or something, to try and further explain what the difference is between like this sort of LLMs and LQMs, because as I've said, a lot of the industry is focused on LLMs to solve every problem and are running into a lot of disappointment, which is where this downward hype curve is coming. So when I talk about LQMs and LQM systems to solve the kinds of scientific problems we're talking about, what do I mean? Well, so there are many different ingredients, right? I had this picture of the iceberg with all the different things underneath. And I want to be using all of those kinds of things together, right? It's not just about, here's one model that's going to solve all my problems. Here's some, attention layer with, some kind of graph embedding and, diffusion models. It's all of that. And one of the themes, actually, that we've found in trying to tackle the problems that we're trying to tackle is that you can't just have a single model. There is no single foundation model that's going to solve all of these problems. You have to have a collection of such things. Maybe if you're, say, trying to solve drug discovery, trying to make progress on drug discovery, which is going to be my main example, that's a very complex problem, right? There's, chemistry, there's molecules, but there's also biology, right? And say protein folding, is AI models for protein folding. This is a Nobel-winning discovery. That's great. That's like that, as great as it is one small part of the larger problem we're trying to solve. And the truth is, every real problem that one would like to solve is greater than the domain of a single foundation model. So there's multiple foundation models, perhaps. There's multiple what I would call equation solvers, because I want to bring in the simulation piece. I want to make that forefront. And then you've got all of your knowledge, right? All the data, right? And really, the flow, right? What is the flow of progress in these domains? It's taking your data, training new models, and then using those models together with non-data driven pieces, but using all of this together to create some kind of virtuous cycle where everything gets better over time. That's the idea, at least. That's what we would like to do. And if we're looking forward, to what comes next, what we'd really like to do is take this kind of cycle where we take new data, train new models, then use those models to generate even more data. We would like to make this, completely automated and agentic and so forth. Okay, so this is kind of what we would like to do in general, but what are some examples? So this is all very high level. Let's get to some examples of how this kind of thing is realized. And I think, as I said, it resonates, I think, a lot with what's been said already at this conference. Maybe one final point to make before getting on to an example is that really the bottleneck is this part right here. So, and let me, wrong button. So, and let me say a little bit more in the context of drug discovery. So how does drug discovery work? Okay, so the way drug discovery works, the problem is we want to find a molecule that will, say, treat a disease, right? And the set of possibilities of things that we could do is this gigantic chemical space that is so big, like the set of possible molecules is so big that we're never going to be able to explore the whole thing. We're never going to know even close. We could be doing experiments, mixing chemicals in test tubes all day. We could be running simulations all day for the life of the universe, and we would never explore it all. And in fact, by its very nature, we're always on the cutting edge. Even as we start to expand the boundary of what's known, well, the next problem that we want to solve is going to have to do with things that we have not yet discovered. So we're constantly in this area where we have to make new discoveries all the time. And that means we don't have a lot of data about what we wish we had data for. And this is where this bottleneck of data comes in, and why something like simulation becomes very important. A combination of, say, physics-based simulation together with lab experiments, for example, that constantly feed this cycle of do some new experiments, and use that to train a model, and then use the model to shortcut the need for doing another simulation or another experiment and move it forward. I think yesterday during some of the talks we heard about these various surrogate models that were being trained in order to obviate the need for doing expensive simulations, say in the context of cosmology. It's the same idea. So this is really a good fraction of what we do at Sandbox. Is we wish we could do simulations all day, but simulations are not fast enough and they're too expensive to really uncover all the things that we know. So we start by doing some simulation, creating some new data, and then using that data, train a new model, like a surrogate model that does a better job than what we could have done before. That allows us to get a little bit further out, but then we have to constantly keep moving to new areas, doing new simulations, and the trick is figuring out which direction to move in this space. So some examples, and you'll see that the example, so that's the general problem of drug discovery, but really to make progress, another kind of theme is extreme specialization, okay? So where have we been able to make progress? Well, we're not out there trying to, say, solve a general problem like protein folding, right? Protein folding is one piece, but if you want to solve the whole end-to-end issue and really discover a drug or help discover a drug, you have to specialize very strongly. And so one mode of specialization is looking at very particular diseases, say these neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, and in fact, working on a particular approach to trying to make progress in those diseases, and that's, say, these prions. If you've never heard of a prion before, there are these very scary malformed proteins that cause other proteins that they run into to similarly become malformed, and they create these chunks in your brain that one of our scientists calls an evil lasagna, based on how it looks here, and it causes terrible problems. And there's some ideas that these are behind some neurodegenerative diseases. And so this is one of the things that we've tackled, and we've developed like whole systems, like something that we call PrionDoc, which is specifically designed to attack these kinds of molecules, to talk about the binding of potential drugs to these sort of molecules. And it does nothing else. It's extreme specialization. But by specializing and applying the general theme, the general LQM theme, we've been able to make progress. So, like as an example, we've been able to speed up enlarge the number of molecules that you're able to test against the target by a lot, and essentially improve the hit rate as well. Like the hit rate meaning how much success do you get when it comes to trying to bind a new molecule to these targets. Well, you'll see that the hit rate, even after improvement, like it's a 30x improvement, it's still like really, really, really small. Okay, and this is what I mean when I say these problems are super hard. Even after specializing and saying we're just going to tackle this problem and we're going to build essentially, you could call it a foundation model, but sort of a foundation model just for these sorts of problems, you still you're still not completely solving the problem. Another example, so I mentioned that data was a big bottleneck. Recently, so we've decided recently that we would, release some of the data that we've computed. So we made this. You can now find it on Hugging Face, actually. This repository where we're trying to connecting some of the dots between biology. So IC50, it has to do with how potent a drug is. And there are data sets from experiments in petri dishes and so on that tabulate this IC50. And then what we did is we went along and computed a bunch of physical molecular structures going along with those databases to enhance the database. And millions of these things. And this is an example of a kind of ingredient that you would have now trying to connect what's happening at the chemistry level to the biology level. And that connecting those dots is really, it's very hard, and it's an important part of doing this kind of end-to-end solution where you don't really have success until you've made a dent on the real problem, which is finding the actual drug. The molecular part by itself doesn't matter. Let me skip a couple of slides here. Another example, still in chemistry, but moving from drug discovery, we have catalyst design. So catalysts, very important ingredients for all kinds of chemical processes, especially at the industrial scale, right? If you can find a better catalyst for an industrial process, you could save all kinds of cost in terms of energy and ingredients. But the current computational methods for handling this kind of thing are extremely slow and expensive. The main one is DFT, density functional theory, which is a very computationally intensive, quantum-based, using wave functions and so on, method for trying to calculate what's going on. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's not good enough to really solve the problem. And so the next level version of trying to solve this kind of problem, again, involves this LQM kind of loop. So here's like a kind of an illustration of how that would go, where you use, there are different parts where you use strong AI components, say generative AI to give you candidates and machine learned force fields and so on that come from some very well-trained model. But then you don't forget about the DFT, right? The simulation is in there. And then in this particular setup, I've also illustrated the kind of lab in the loop piece. And the adding that, which we don't do, but is an important part of the overall, we don't do ourselves, but is an important part of the overall success, is really a key piece. So the basic idea is that in order to make progress on any of these problems, we need to include AI, simulation, right, physics-based simulation, but then also at some point we need to test for real what's going on. And it's only when you're tackling the whole problem are you able to make progress. And as I've said, this is the thing that we care about, and it's very hard unless you specialize. So just a couple other examples, of areas that we work in, where the pattern is the same. And if you're interested in more details, please ask me after. But I just wanted to give this sort of illustrations. And the summary is that these, when we think about trying to solve these holistic problems, right? When we think about trying to make impact at the level where it's going to really matter, in our case, to a customer or to a customer's customer, if we want to make a new drug or make a actual, say, industrially relevant chemical process more efficient, you really need to use the whole set of tools, all of the tools in the toolbox, including AI, but also including non-AI methods and lab in the loop and all of that. And this is the thing that we call the LQM. So thank you for your attention.
All right, good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you again to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. And also thanks to everyone so far for what's been a really amazing symposium. And it's been great to meet many of you and speak to many of you over the last few days. I'm going to be talking to you today about the ongoing AI revolution in weather forecasting. Now, right off the bat, putting the word revolution into the talk in front of an academic audience risks an eye roll. It's a bit provocative, it's a bit cliche, it's a bit non-academic. So in a sense, I'm setting up the goal of the talk to justify this grandiose title. But really, I think that to the extent that a revolution represents a rapid and radical break from established practice and something of a paradigm shift, I think there is a really good case to be made that we're seeing something of a revolution in the weather forecasting field. So weather forecasting has been a kind of scientific grand challenge for a long time. We've had decades worth of research and making a lot of very substantial progress. And the established way that we do weather forecasting is with physics-based simulation. We essentially simulate the physics of the atmosphere and kind of integrate that forward in time. And even if we go back just 4 years, the consensus view in the meteorological community, I think it's fair to say, is roughly captured by this, which was written by Tim Palmer, a renowned scientist in the field, which was that AI will never compete seriously with numerical weather prediction, that's physics-based models, in the all-important medium range. So medium range in weather forecasting refers to the kind of 10-day to 2-week time horizon. Now, this wasn't just Tim's view or even just the view of these pioneers of numerical weather prediction. It was actually also a view shared by some of the early pioneers of AI for weather prediction. So Stefan, for example, he's now a colleague of mine at Google DeepMind. He was doing a lot of the early impressive work in this field, but this was a sentiment he expressed in a journal paper as well in 2021. Right, if we fast forward to today, 2025, the best performing operational medium range weather models are AI models. Right? And these are not just research papers, these are models that are being run in real time, being supported by weather agencies. So worth putting into context the pace of this change. So what you're seeing on the left of the screen here is a chart that you can go find on the European Weather Center's, ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather's website. And what it's showing on the y-axis is the anomaly correlation coefficient for 500 hectopascal geopotential. The name of the variable is not important. What's important is that this is treated as something of a diagnostic variable for the overall quality of a medium range forecast. And the x-axis here is years. So we're going kind of from 1980 to now 2025. And what's being plotted is the 3-day, 5-day, 7-day accuracy or skill of these forecasts in blue, in pink, in green. And what you basically see is a rough trend. To get the accuracy at 5 days that you used to have at 3 days out takes about 20 years of research progress in the field. And we can look at other metrics as well. So now we're looking at a plot which is showing data from the National Hurricane Center. The x-axis again is years, and on the y-axis now we're showing the average error that is made by predictions of the tracks of tropical cyclones. And again, we see this kind of rough rule of thumb emerging. If we want to improve the accuracy by, say, 2 days worth of lead time, that takes 20 years worth of research. And we end up with this kind of rough rule of thumb. If we want a 1 day's worth of skill improvement, which takes a decade's worth of research in the field. So let's compare that to what we're kind of seeing with AI now. If on the right of the screen, I'm showing a plot from our most recent medium range weather model. And again, we're looking now at cyclone track prediction error. The x-axis now is lead time, so how far into the future are you predicting? And the orange curve here is ENS, which is the physics-based ensemble model from the ECMWF, the European Center. This is the gold standard, state-of-the-art physics-based model. And you see that the error that their model is achieving about 3 days in advance, 3.5 days, 3.6 days in advance, is about the error of a 5-day forecast into the future of our model. So that's about a 1.3 to 1.5 day improvement. So we've gone from 2021 having models, no medium range AI weather models competitive with the state-of-the-art numerical weather prediction, to being potentially, according to these crude approximations, a decade to a decade and a half ahead in just a couple of years. So the pace is dramatic. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is, firstly, I'm just going to give a high-level overview of the traditional classical weather forecasting pipeline, just so we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to take a very high-level walk through some of the key milestones and advances that we've made in medium-range prediction so far. And towards the end, I'll just try and tie together some of the ongoing trends and future directions that I think we should look out for or will be good, which we're likely to see going forward. Okay, so the classical weather forecasting pipeline is made up of a couple of stages. And the first is an extensive observation network of sensors and satellites and weather stations across the world, collecting measurements, direct or indirect measurements of the weather. So this is an enormous set of measurements, but it's a sparse in space and time set. We don't observe all of the weather variables all of the time everywhere. And so as was explained earlier in the great talk this morning, the first step the next step is to infer what the state of the atmosphere is now everywhere. So we want to basically solve this inverse problem and come up with an estimate of the weather now. Say, you can imagine some grid, say like a latitude-longitude grid, and at every location, we want to infer what is the value of all the weather variables that we care about, the temperature, wind, humidity, pressure, things like that, at all the different levels of the atmosphere that we care about as well. Now, once we have this state, this estimate of the weather now, there's a forecasting step. This is the step where we need to simulate the atmospheric dynamics, forward in time. We need to produce an estimate of what is the weather going to be on this same grid at some time in the future. And then finally, in reality and operational setting, there's a post-processing, typically one or more sets of post-processing steps. Right? So sometimes you want to forecast at a higher resolution than your core model has generated. Maybe you need to bias correct the forecast based on some local information, interpolate it to a point doesn't lie exactly on the grid. So that first step is called data assimilation. That's what you heard about a little bit about this morning as well. Then we've got a forecasting step, and then we've got a post-processing step. Now this post-processing step, this has actually been done with statistical methods, statistical post-processing for a long time. That's quite well established. It's also an area that people started to apply kind of standard machine learning techniques to. But these first two stages, data assimilation and forecasting, these have traditionally required and been based on physics-based models, or numerical weather prediction, NWP. So I'll use physics-based NWP, numerical weather prediction, interchangeably. They kind of mean the same thing. So what we're going to be focusing on in this talk is the forecasting stage. How do we predict atmospheric dynamics and predict the state of the atmosphere in the future? And specifically, we're going to focus on this grand challenge of global medium range prediction. In part because this is, on top of being this big challenge, this is where the AI revolution in weather forecasting, I'd say, is first really started and is also the most mature. Okay, so next we're going to take a high-level walkthrough, very high-level, I'd say, walkthrough of some of the big breakthroughs that have got us to where we are today. And the first is in the context of what we're calling deterministic medium-range forecasting. So this is we say deterministic in the sense that the task here is to produce a single best estimate guess of how is the weather going to develop now, given our initial estimate of the current state. And as I've touched on, the standard numerical weather prediction approach is that we're going to simulate the grid level physics of the atmosphere by numerically integrating physical equations forward in time, and we're going to couple those with what are called parameterizations, which are models that simulate the effect of the subgrid physics that aren't resolved in that simulation. Right? We're solving a PDE. That means if you want to increase the accuracy and faithfulness of the simulation, you increase spatio-temporal resolution of that simulation. That's, of course, extremely computationally expensive. And in fact, global weather simulations are known to be incredibly computationally intensive. They are run on some of the world's largest supercomputers, and they take sometimes hours to compute. The machine learning approach is really quite different and in a way quite simple. We treat this as a classic supervised learning problem, right? We have some data at some point time t. We want to predict what is the data point going to be at time t+1, and we minimize the mean squared error of that function over some data set. So what is the data set that we're using? The enabling data set that kind of has sparked and enabled the kind of revolution that we're seeing is this ERA 5 reanalysis data set. So this is, you heard about reanalysis again this morning. This is a historical recreation of our best estimate of what the state of the atmosphere was over the last, say, 70 years. This was released by the ECNWF, and it's been a huge enabler for science. And so each data point we have, xt, is a frame of the weather. So you can think of this as latitude, longitude grid, and then a lot of channels, let's say 85 channels or so. It's different weather variables that you care about, and at different levels of the atmosphere, and then surface variables as well. And then we do the standard thing. We split our data set into a training set, validation set, test set. Ideally, you have, hopefully you have the training set be strictly earlier in time than the validation set earlier in time than the test set, because if you want to deploy a weather model, you're going to deploy it in the future. But once we have this function that produces the weather state at the next time step, to generate a 10-day forecast, we just auto-regressively roll the model out number of steps. So it's a simple problem to formulate, but the complexity of the dynamics that we are trying to learn, the complexity of this function, meant that many thought that it was going to be roughly impossible to learn successfully. Okay, a quick sidebar is that I've currently framed it as if there's physics-based prediction, and then there's data-driven prediction, and it's a very kind of crude distinction. Potentially, maybe that's roughly accurate, but you might think of there being something more of a sliding scale between the two. So there, on the right of the scale, there's a collection of purely data-driven methods. That means there's no physics involved at all, but with architectures that have varying degrees of inductive bias that are put in them. But there do exist a class of methods between these purely data-driven methods and numerical weather prediction, which try something of a hybrid approach. Neural GCM is a kind of archetypal example of this. They build a model where they do have a fluid dynamics simulator. They write a fully end-to-end differentiable global circulation model, and then they couple that with some physics that's learned by a neural network, and they're able to roll that out and backpropagate through the rollout to learn the neural network part of the model while having a kind of physics core as well. Our attention is going to be on the purely data-driven side of things, both because it's the most operationally mature. It's also really, this is where the paradigm shift is kind of most significant. So as AI was experiencing its deep learning boom, late 2010s, people started trying to apply deep learning to the task of weather prediction. And so what we're looking at here is a plot that was put together by Stefan, who I mentioned, a colleague of mine who's done a lot of work in benchmarking AI weather models. And you're looking at a plot of the 3-day temperature global average of the root mean squared error of 3-day temperature predictions at a particular level in the atmosphere. Again, this is just a diagnostic variable. You'd see a similar plot if you look at other variables. And the y-axis here is the percentage skill, basically relative to the gold standard deterministic physics-based model. And so people were seeing some progress up until about 2021, but things were not doing too well. About 50%, 60% of that accuracy relative to the state of the art, and not meaningfully competitive. And then first, the breakthrough happened in 2022. First with a paper by Ryan Kiesler, who's actually a solo researcher. Very impressive piece of work, and didn't start beating the physics-based models, but achieved a big step up in accuracy. And then it turns out that at the same time there were already at least 2 groups that were working on this problem, and by the end of the year we had 2 more models published, Pangu Weather and GraphCast, which was by our team at DeepMind, and both of these models now were matching or outperforming the state-of-the-art in numerical weather prediction. Now, since then, many more models have been published and have similarly outperformed the state-of-the-art in numerical weather prediction and have continued to push this advance. I'm going to talk very briefly about our GraphCast model and how it works. The setup is essentially what I said. We're going to take in a weather state, which is this kind of 3D grid of the atmosphere with all of the variables we care about at the input state. In practice, we take in the past 2 weather states. We're going to predict the next state. And at a very high level, the architecture has 3 main components. It's got an encoder component that basically takes the data that lives on the grid and maps it to a latent state on a spherical mesh. Then there's a graph. There's a GNN set of message passing steps with a GNN on this mesh to do some processing. This is the processor step, and then there's a decoder that maps back to the latitude-longitude grid. And in general, I mean, this is not just in this domain, but very much in this kind of high-level encode, process, decode framework is something that you're going to see that is common to almost all the weather models we'll speak about. And in fact, this graph neural network-based approach is quite similar to approach that Ryan Kessler was trying in that 2022 paper. To generate a forecast, again, we roll the model out autoregressively, taking its own predictions as inputs. One thing that was key to getting long-term accurate performance, so skillful forecasts, not just at one step, but at 10 days time, was to do autoregressive training, autoregressive rollouts during training. So at train time, you roll out the model autoregressively, you compute a loss at all of those different steps, and you backpropagate the error through that whole rollout process. And it has a very clear and strong benefit in that it definitely improves performance at longer time horizons. But it also has the effect of causing blurring and progressively more blurring of the forecast as you go longer lead times. So for example, on the right here, what you're looking at is the power spectrum of the forecasts from the GraphCast model compared of the specific humidity, which is a kind of variable that has lots of high frequency in it, and the ground truth is the black, and the forecasts are from GraphCast are in blue, and the darker blue is the longer lead times. And what this is essentially showing you is this blurring phenomenon, that the forecasts lose power at the higher frequencies, especially at longer lead times. Now, this is a perfectly expected phenomenon because what we're doing is we're training a model to minimize mean squared error, and that is essentially asking it to predict something like a conditional mean. And in the presence of uncertainty, the model, in order to minimize mean squared error, is going to blur its forecasts. And what this is really getting at is a fundamental problem with the task of deterministic forecasting itself. The weather is inherently uncertain. It's not predictable exactly. And so what we don't really want necessarily just a best guess of what the atmosphere will be. We want to understand the conditional distribution over future weather trajectories, so we can calculate the probabilities of different scenarios. Again, you heard a little bit about this yesterday, and this is called ensemble forecasting. And this is why state-of-the-art deterministic forecasting is not the same thing as state-of-the-art operational weather forecasting. Because in reality, in an operational setting, we rely on ensemble forecasts. And the way that physics-based models produce ensemble forecasts is that we basically take this physics simulation and we run that simulation multiple times with some perturbations in the model and from perturbed initial conditions. And if we do that 50 times, then we have a 50-member ensemble, and we can use that to compute our Monte Carlo estimates of whatever quantities of interest, expectations, and probabilities that we care about. So the machine learning approach to this, right, we want to learn the probability distribution over future weather trajectories over multiple time steps. And if we make a Markov assumption, which is typical in the field, then this factorizes into the distribution over the product of the distributions of a given time step conditional on the previous time step. And so this is the model that we would like to learn. And in 2023, end of 2023, and then what we did was we published GenCast and later a higher resolution version, early 2024, which was the first machine learning based weather model to outperform this real state of the art, the operational numerical weather ensemble models. So this is a headline result. I'll pause to say that evaluating weather models is a rigorous and endeavor that requires lots of different metrics, looking at lots of different variables. And if you're interested, all of the papers have between 30 and 80-page appendices that you can go and check out with a very rigorous set of metrics. What you're looking at here is like a headline scorecard. So the metric we're considering is the continuous rank probability score. This is a measure of how well the predictive distribution fits with the ground truth distribution. It's the kind of standard headline metric that's used by the weather agencies in operational contexts. And so the scorecard works like this. Each of the blocks is a variable. Each of the rows in a block is a level in the atmosphere, and the lead time is on the x-axis. So one square is a given lead time for a given variable at a given level in the atmosphere. And they're color-coded based on relative performance. Blue means that GenCast is performing better. Red means that ENS, the baseline, is performing better. And GenCast, the headline takeaway is that GenCast is performing better in more than 97% of these cases. So GenCast is a diffusion model. It uses diffusion to generate the sample for the next time step, and then rolls out autoregressively, conditioning on that sample to generate a full trajectory. If you want to generate an ensemble of trajectories, you repeat that process multiple times. And since this work has been published, there's been a lot of really great work on further advancing using diffusion for weather forecasting. You've heard a little bit about it. I think you're going to hear a little bit more about it in a few talks' time. Now, diffusion has the really great property that we are explicitly targeting the full joint conditional distribution across the spatial and intervariable dimensions of our data, right? So we care about spatial correlations in our weather state and correlations between different variables, and that's kind of explicitly what we're trying to optimize if we're learning the distribution. It does have some drawbacks, though. Firstly, from a machine learning perspective, it's like a relatively expensive model because we have to do this iterative denoising process, so multiple function calls to generate a single next time step. And one of the consequences of that is there isn't an obvious and simple way necessarily to do this autoregressive training trick where you backpropagate all the way through sampling and optimize your long-term predictions. Nonetheless, so as a result, this is a model that we only ever train to predict one step in the future. It never sees its own predictions as inputs during training time. Nonetheless, as we showed, it rolls out stably and skillfully and better, in fact, gives us better predictions than the state-of-the-art physics models. But things have been moving very fast since we have published GenCast. Many different models have been published. I'm going to forget a lot of them. They'll be in the references of the slides. AIFS CRPS has come out, Fushi ENS has come out, I think there was a Fengwu ENS version. There's a lot of different models coming out. Of course, you heard about one, the ForecastNet 3 that's come out, and you heard about it yesterday. In our team, less than 1 year after GenCast was published, we were already sharing forecasts with trusted testers from a new model that we developed, which we're calling functional generative networks, and which we've recently put out as well. I'll give you a very, very high-level walkthrough of how this works. The idea is that for a given input state, you feed that to a model along with some independently sampled vector of noise, in our case, a deliberately low-dimensional vector of noise. And that's going to give you, for each time you do that, you're going to get an output of the function. So to generate an ensemble out of this model, you sample multiple different independent noise vectors, and you pass the same input through with each of those different noise vectors, and you get an ensemble of outputs. Right? So now we're in the context where generating a single member of the ensemble, a single step of a single member of the ensemble takes one function call to generate without iterative denoising. And in practice, just to flag that we actually have a model ensemble approach to this. So we train 4 independent copies of this model, and each one will generate a quarter of the ensemble. And that's accounting both for the kind of stochastic physics in the stochastic model itself and some uncertainty that we have about the parameters of the model. And the model is trained using this CRPS rule, a CRPS scoring rule as the loss function. And again, this is something that you heard a little bit about yesterday as well. The idea is that at train time, you generate 2 different samples. So for the same input, you sample 2 different vectors of noise, and you generate a two-member ensemble, essentially. And then you apply the CRPS which calculates, gives you a score for that distribution. We use a fair estimate to account for the fact that we've got such a small ensemble. And then we can backpropagate through that, and we optimize the parameters. Now, the one key difference, the decision that we're making here, that's different to some of the work that you heard yesterday, is that we are choosing to impose the CRPS loss only on the marginals of this distribution. So if you think about each of these predictions is a grid, with, say, latitude by longitude by number of channels, and we're basically imposing the CRPS, which is a univariate scoring rule, on each of the pixels independently, and then appropriately averaging them. Right? And this is somewhat different to what you heard yesterday, where the CRPS is imposed both in the spatial domain, like we're doing here, but also in the spectral domain across the spherical harmonic coefficients. Neither of these works is the first work to use the CRPS loss. Just to flag that the neural GCM work that I mentioned before takes a similar approach to ForecastNet in imposing CRPS loss in the both spatial and the spectral domain. The AIFS CRPS work, which is from the ECMWF more recently, takes actually a very similar approach in general to the work here, the FGN kind of model and architecture. So, I mean, what have we kind of ended up with? Might seem like we've got something of a trade-off. So in the diffusion context, we were explicitly targeting the kind of full distribution, accounting for these intervariable and interspatial covariances. And as I've just explained, we're explicitly not doing that with the loss, at least in the FGN context. We're imposing the loss on the marginals, and so we don't have a guarantee that we're going to get good joint structure in the weather distribution, and that's something that we need. On the other hand, we've got a single forward pass and not many forward passes. We're likely to be much more efficient. And now, given this simple sampling procedure, we now are in a context again where we can do autoregressive training. We can roll out the model multiple steps and calculate CRPS of the two samples at each step and backpropagate all the way through. So do we have a trade-off? In reality, it turns out we have not been able to find one. So FGN first is more than 8 times faster. That's something that we expected. But it's also better both on metrics computed on the marginals of the distribution and those which involve joint structure. So in the marginals, I'm showing again the same sort of scorecard, but now we're comparing FGN with that GenCast, which was now the established state of the art. And what the takeaway is that it's all blue. Up to 20% better sometimes, and on average about 6.5% better. And you might say, well, this is obviously expected. You were explicitly, your CRPS was your loss. And so if you look only at the CRPS evaluation of the marginals, then maybe it's a little bit unfair. But actually, we can, when we look at evaluations which require getting joint structure right, we still see FGN still performing better. Now, there isn't one single evaluation of how good is your joint distribution, but one of the ways that we can do it is to look at applications or downstream evaluations which are of phenomena which fundamentally involve these correlations. So cyclones are a really great example of that. They involve different variables, different low pressure systems, winds up high in the atmosphere, and a lot of spatial correlations. And so this is showing a cyclone tracking evaluation. How accurate are the cyclone tracks that we get from the weather forecast produced by GenCast compared to FGN? GenCast in black, FGN in blue. This is the position error, so lower is better, and you see a really substantial improvement that you get from FGN over GenCast. Okay, so far, I've shown you a lot of models which have advanced the state of the art in medium range prediction. They've all trained on error 5 analysis, and those that become operational on HRES analysis. So these are the single big data set historical recreation or best estimate of the weather. And already we're seeing a trend to go beyond just training on this single data set. So, for example, the Aurora paper, which came out of the team from Microsoft, one of the techniques that model has is to pre-train not just on error 5, but on combinations of analysis and even of forecasts from numerical weather predictions. And so what this graph is showing basically is the percentage error that they get with different combinations of data sets in their pre-training set, the different colors of the different combinations, orange being the best combination overall. And this is one which contains not just error 5, but CMIP 6, so climate simulation data, and also one-day forecasts from numerical weather prediction. So the general idea here, okay, expanding the data set, a bigger data set is better, true. But all analysis, global reanalysis and global numerical weather prediction simulation data, they all suffer some shortfalls. And the first is that data simulation, which generates this data, doesn't assimilate all observations. So there's a lot of data, a lot of weather observations that is not informing these the training data that we've got, and so we're leaving some data on the table by only relying on the product of this assimilation process. And the second is that there are phenomena and there is data that doesn't get resolved or represented in this data assimilation product because of the resolution at which it is done. So a good example of this is that if you looked in error 5 for category 5 level cyclone winds, you're just not going to find them. They aren't there. And so no surprise, a model that is trained on that analysis doesn't learn to resolve that kind of intense cyclone when in its prediction. So we can expect a broad set of improvements from moving beyond dense gridded analysis in general. And I think, let's go back to the cyclone examples. Cyclone example as a really good case study. So traditionally, the model that produces the best predictions of a track of a cyclone is not the same model that predicts the best prediction, gives the best prediction of its intensity. The best track predictions tend to come from global medium-range models. These are models which have a full field of view. They capture the kind of large-scale global steering currents that determine the track of a cyclone. But the best intensity predictions tend to come from regional models, which are run at much higher resolution and capture the kind of complex internal structure of a cyclone that determines its intensity. And so what we've seen so far is that these models, the kind of state-of-the-art AI weather models that are trained on reanalysis data, they're better on track prediction than these state-of-the-art physics-based models, but they are worse, significantly worse on predicting intensity. The good news is that with the right data, our global machine learning weather models don't have to face the same dichotomy as physics-based models. And as a case study or as existence proof of this, I want to show you our recent experimental cyclone model. So this is a model which is state-of-the-art in weather prediction as well. It's as good as FGN, but it's trained both on global reanalysis data and on cyclone-specific data, which captures track, intensity, and structure of cyclones. And so here are two plots showing some of the headline results. The left plot is track error, and the right plot is intensity error. Again, lead time, your forecast horizon here is on the x-axis, and track error, intensity error is the y-axis in both cases. So we've got the gray model is these regional high-resolution models, and the orange model is the global ENS model, the state-of-the-art track prediction model. And you do indeed see that orange is better than gray in the track prediction. Orange is worse than gray in intensity prediction. But the obvious takeaway is that our new model, which is trained on both of these data sets at the same time, is significantly better both on tracks, but also giving state-of-the-art intensity predictions. And as a quick shout out, you can, if you want to go, this model is running live, and we've got a little website that you can go and look at the forecasts, look at the intensity forecasts, compare the forecasts to other models. So feel free to check that out. Okay, very briefly, let's zoom out again to the rest of the pipeline. We've kind of walked through some of the big developments in medium range forecasting. As you've already heard today, there has been and is ongoing work in trying to do this first process, this inverse problem with machine learning based methods. Now the idea here is that what we've shown so far is a pipeline where one stage will be done by machine learning, but it still fundamentally depends on this analysis product, and this analysis product currently requires physics-based models. So if you were able to successfully achieve state-of-the-art data assimilation with machine learning, then that might no longer be the case, and we might no longer be depending on physics-based models in an AI-only pipeline. There's also work trying to do fully end-to-end prediction with machine learning. So why do we need all of these stages? Let's just be direct. Have a machine learning model that takes all the observations in and it spits out the forecast that you want. This kind of end-to-end prediction, early work in this has included, for example, the Aardvark paper, and I think Fushi Weather was another attempt at end-to-end prediction. So in both instances, we aren't at the stage yet where these methods are outperforming the operational state-of-the-art systems. But as you have heard, they're improving fast. There's a lot of ongoing research, so there are definitely areas that we should watch. Right. I'll try then just to pull together, I think, some of the things that I've mentioned into ongoing trends that we're seeing in the field and things to watch. Because I think, well, I'll hope that I have convinced you that we're now at a stage where AI models are better at medium-range forecasting and that they're improving fast still. So what are we seeing? I'd say a first important trend is that we're seeing increasing trust and operational adoption by weather agencies of these methods. So a good example is the fact that the ECMWF, this European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, they've been developing their own AI models. AIFS is the deterministic one. AIFS, I think CRPS or AIFS Ensemble are their ensemble products, and these are now running operationally real-time, supported by ECMWF. Another example is that we at Google DeepMind, our team has now got a partnership with the National Hurricane Center. So this season, forecasters at the National Hurricane Center are looking at our forecast of cyclones in real time so that they can understand them, build trust in them, evaluate them in real time, and look at them a lot as an experimental model alongside other guidance models when they're making their decisions, for warnings and alerts that they send out. Second, as I mentioned, there's definitely a trend to move beyond analysis-only models. We have more data, so we should use it. We should, as input, we should train to target that data, and I think that's a kind of obvious thing that we're seeing across a lot of research. As I mentioned, there's a potential movement to these fully end-to-end AI systems. Like, can we just take observations and predict the weather directly? And so it's yet to be proven that this can beat out a pipeline of the best individual stages, but something to watch for. There's an obvious trend and pattern and benefit that we have, obviously, in the field of AI, or AI for science, that the broader AI field is making continuous advances in generative modeling, advances in neural network architectures, and we have the benefit of importing those and improving our models as those models improve. And this has happened already with obvious examples: diffusion models, transformer architectures, techniques like conditional normalization, like LoRa. The development of these techniques is obviously benefiting the quality of predictions that we get out of our AI models. I've wanted to flag this kind of trend as something of its own, this increasing use of probabilistic scoring rules for training probabilistic weather models. It's been used in ULGCM, in FGN, AIFS, CRPS, in ForecastNet that you heard yesterday. It was also, I think, Microsoft put out another paper with a model called Huracan a couple of days ago. It looks like they're using this as well. So it'll be interesting to see whether this stands the test of time, or whether it gets replaced by the next great probabilistic objective that improves performance further. Next, now that we've really got existence proof of the power of AI weather forecasting, people are thinking about pushing to the seasonal to sub-seasonal time horizon. This is like 6 weeks to potentially 6 months. And as a good example of the kind of investment and excitement about this area, the ECMWF themselves have been running a competition, a sub-seasonal AI weather forecasting competition called WeatherQuest over the course of this year. And finally, just an important whole area of research that I haven't had the opportunity to talk about is that there's ongoing work to both understand the implications of the success of these models and also their limitations and their failure modes. And that latter point is extremely important. Extremely important, firstly, because we need to be deploying these models responsibly, and so understanding their limitations and failure modes are important. But it's also important as a feedback mechanism to understand where we need to focus the research and improve the forecasts. And in particular, we found that a very fruitful aspect of the partnership that we have with the National Hurricane Center as they look at our forecasts. Okay, with that, of course, there's lots of papers cited in the talk that are not only from our group, but I've spoken mostly about work that's been done in our group, and it's been done over the course of a number of years by a really incredible group of researchers and collaborators. So this is them. And with that, just thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. I think it's very fun that it's data simulation that is masked out. The inverse problem is an inverse problem. Hello everyone, thank you for letting me talk here. My name is Martin and I'm a PhD student at Linköping University. And today I will mainly talk about weather forecasting, but I will also, hopefully if I have time, do a bit on data simulation in the end also. And so the first project and the project that is in the program is this paper that we presented at iClear previously this year. And it's on continuing the weather forecasting theme. It's on using diffusion models to do ensemble forecast at a high temporal resolution. And so we looked at the current AI-based forecasting methods. And we saw that most of them operated at a fairly coarse temporal resolution. So 6 hours or more. And when we looked at the diffusion-based ones, such as the GenCast one before, we saw that these had an even coarser 12 or even 24-hour resolution. And I mean, this is very far from the NWP standards where you have resolution of sub 1 hour. And so we asked why this was. And we came up with two possible reasons for this. And the first one is a quite easy one to guess, and it's that forecasting at a high resolution is very expensive, right? And it's been a push towards going to higher spatial resolution, but we haven't seen the same push towards going to higher temporal resolution. And part of the reason for this might be because of the second reason here, which was mentioned also yesterday in a talk, is that these models seem to scale very poorly when you increase the number of steps. And we, or I in this talk, will tell you about a new ensemble forecasting approach that solves, or at least attempts to solve, these two issues. And so we set out the goal to do 10-day global ensemble weather forecasts at this 1 hour resolution. And the data we chose is much smaller than anything you saw before lunch now, but it's crucially at this 1 hour resolution here. And so we wanted to do a diffusion model for this, but we didn't want to focus on the architecture, so we chose a simple one that worked well for images. And so when you say that you want to train a diffusion model for something, you have to specify what you want the diffusion model to sample from. And so in the end, what we're interested in is samples from the joint trajectory distribution given some previous history. And however, trying to model this directly with the diffusion model is a very hard and expensive task. So the approach that's been taken in weather forecasting is to instead model this one-step conditional distribution. So the distribution of xt into the future, given some previous history, and sometimes condition also on the t into the future. And then we say we train a model for this, and then the trajectories, that's just a sampling problem. So we worry about that later. And so to get you a primer on diffusion, what you would do is, if you wanted to train a model like this, you would set up your objective, which would be to denoise noisy weather states. And then to make sure that you're sampling from this conditional distribution, you would also use the previous history and sometimes the lead time as additional input. And then to generate a forecast, what you would do is you would solve an ODE, starting in some random Gaussian noise and ending up in your forecast. And then if you want tens or hundreds of forecasts, you just sample some new random noise and you do it all over again. But I promised you trajectories, and so we asked the question, how do we get the trajectories from this? And well, there are the most common way of doing this, and the way Ilan described in GenCast, for example, is what's called autoregressive forecasting. And the idea then is to, let's choose a fixed lead time, and then it's model the one-step prediction of x1 given the previous history. And this allows us to very naturally formulate this autoregressive sampling scheme where you can sample from the trajectory by just iterating this over time. And so if you did this, and you did it on a 24-hour lead time, or a time step, and you did this for the 10-day forecast we set up, we get really good results. So we're better than the climatology, which is kind of what you call skill in this setting, for up to 10 days. And if you increase the resolution to 6 hours, you're still fairly good and you have a lot of skill, but it is when you go to 1 hour, you can really see this error accumulation start to add up. So we conclude that while autoregressive forecasting is very efficient with a long step, it's not the way to go if you want to find the time resolution. So is there another option? Well, there is another option, which I like to refer to as continuous forecasting. And the idea then is to, let's not fix the lead time. Let's choose a variable lead time and model this one-step prediction from the previous history to any time t into the future. And this has a lot of really nice properties. And one of them, the first one, is that there is no longer any sequential operation in your forecasting. So if you give me enough GPUs, you can just do the same forecast you would do up to 10 days in the same time that you would do one forecast before. There is also no error accumulation, since we're trained explicitly for what we're using it for. So we don't have to worry about the errors accumulating over time. And finally, it's also much more flexible in which lead times you choose and which initial conditions you choose, because you're no longer restricted to this autoregressive sampling scheme. So what's the catch? Well, of course there's going to be a catch here. People don't use this. And the catch is that, and some of you might have thought this already, what we're doing is we're going from the initial condition to the marginals at each of these times, right? There's no link between the 1, 6, and 24 hour here. And if you, for example, just try to put them together in a time series and plot them, you will get something that looks like this. So you're close to the truth at every point, but there's no correlation over time. And we're really interested in the trajectories for many of the applications. So this is a big problem. But it had all these nice properties, right? So we ask, is there a way to solve this and use continuous forecasting and still get the trajectories? And the answer is yes, since I asked the question. And this is the main contribution of our work, and I will explain to you how it works. And we refer to this as continuous ensemble forecasting. So imagine you want to, given an initial condition, you want to forecast at 1, 6, and 24 hours. And you want this to come from a single trajectory. So what you would do, you would start by sampling some random noise, and you would do this diffusion sampling to get the 1 hour forecast. And then to create this link between the 1, 6, and 24 hour ones, what we propose to do is that you take the same Gaussian noise that you use to generate the 1 hour one, and you use it to generate the 6 and the 24 hour ones. So we now created a link between these forecasts through this fixed noise here. And to give you an idea of why this would be a good thing to do, we can focus on the diffusion here, which, as I said before, can be realized by just solving an invertible ODE, starting in the noise and ending in the forecast. So we have basically removed all the randomness in the model by fixing this noise. So what we're left is a deterministic forecasting model that can go from the initial condition and the fixed noise to any of the times we want. And it turns out, and I will show you the proof of, or the visual proof of this later, that this actually gives you consistent trajectories over time. And further, it turns out that you don't even have to fix the noise. It's enough to highly correlate this with some kind of noise process. And if you try and do this for up to 10 days, you get better results than before, but you're still quite far off from the 24-hour ones. And to any atmospheric scientists that I showed this to, they're relieved of this, because this means that given the weather today, you can't predict the weather 5 or 10 days into the future in a single step, which makes sense, right? The correlation is very small at that time range. And so what we realized to make this useful is that what we've developed here is not just a way of doing continuous forecasting, but more of a generalization of both autoregressive and continuous forecasting. And if we combine these two, we can get good performance on both short and long lead times. And so we propose to do this, and we call it RKey. And the idea then is very simple. You use continuous forecasting on the first 24 hours, and then you start over with this forecast, with a 24-hour one as the new initial condition, and then you do continuous forecasting again. And so when you do this, and we're really proud of this result, you can show that you can actually match the skill of the 24-hour purely autoregressive one, while still having good performance on the 1-hour resolution. And I promised I'd show you the trajectories also. So here are 4 of the atmospheric fields, and we have 3 samples: the ground truth, the ensemble mean, and standard deviation. And if you stare at these long enough, or enough of these, you can convince yourself that it is actually continuous in time. And so, to the skeptic, I should also say that you can do things to verify this numerically. One way to do this would be to look at the temporal difference over time. And so if the forecast was uncorrelated, this would explode over time or increase over time. But if it was correlated, you'd expect it to stay kind of stable over time. And you can see that our fixing of the noise has this nice property. And since this is a probabilistic model, I should also just bring up these probabilistic metrics and show that we are comparable in that sense also, and that we perform well compared to other probabilistic models. So to summarize this part of the talk, we propose a new framework for ensemble weather forecasting that combines autoregressive and continuous forecasting in a single model, scales very efficiently to high temporal resolution, and crucially doesn't suffer from this error accumulation. And if you want to know more about this, I have a QR code in the end where you can scan to get to the paper. But so for the last 8 or so minutes of this talk, I wanted to spend on data simulation. And this is a very recent project that I'm working on together with Eric, who's also here today, and so was a postdoc. And so we've had a lot of good talks on inverse problems already, so I feel like I'm fortunate enough to be at the end here and make use of the terminology that's been developed before. And so in the context of weather forecasting, as mentioned before, the inverse problem we're trying to solve is estimating the current weather state X, estimating the current state weather state X. And then to do this, we assume to have access to some kind of observations, which might come from land observations or satellite observations of some kind. We also assume to have access to some kind of likelihood, either exact or estimated, as in the lensing case yesterday. And finally, to make this work, we have to assume that we have some kind of prior, which is supposed to represent all possible weather states. And when you formulate it in this way, you get a Bayesian inference problem, and you can use the methods for doing this kind of Bayesian inference here. And so the big question mark here on making this work is this prior P of X here. And traditionally, classical data simulation methods have tried to assume a functional form for this P. And then it's nice because you can do all the calculations exactly. But a more recent one, and which one we heard this morning, is that you can actually express this prior as a flow-based generative model or a diffusion model. And if you have such a model, you can very simply sample from this by solving this SDE or ODE, starting in some random noise and ending in your sample. And I wanted to put this equation up here just to show you that by tuning this epsilon parameter or setting it to 0, you can do it deterministically. So you have the option of doing it less or more noisy. And so, as was also mentioned in previous talks, to sample from the posterior, you approximate the posterior score by this base rule for this course here. And as we also saw this morning, this has shown really strong, and yesterday also, has shown really strong results in practice. However, data simulation is a bit different, or at least my take on data simulation. And the key thing that makes this different from many of the other inverse problems is that the observations Y alone are, in some sense, very insufficient to reconstruct X. I put up here an example from ECMWF of land surface stations, which really shows how sparse these observations are. And you have to imagine that from this and some satellite, you have to reconstruct the entire Earth and all vertical levels of all the atmospheric fields. However, the key thing that separates data simulation from the static, as I like to call it, inverse problem, is that we already have a very good guess of X, which is given by our favorite forecasting model. And so if we modify the posterior to, instead of sampling from just the unconditional prior, you have this modified prior where you also condition on the forecast, we can hope to maybe get a better reconstruction of the weather state. And however, we spent all this time training our diffusion model, And now I'm coming and telling you that you have to condition this on a forecast as well. And you say that, oh, maybe I have a favorite forecasting model right now, but in a few months, DeepMind will release a new one, and then this one will be obsolete. So is there a way of doing this without having to retrain our diffusion model? And the answer, as I said, and the answer is yes, I think. And I will show you a way to do this using what's called diffusion-based inversion of the forecast. And diffusion models, they work by learning an invertible map between noise and images. So if we have sampled some noise, we can sample an image by just solving the SDE or OD forwards. However, in the inversion context, or in our context, what we have here is an image or a forecast, and we want to go the opposite way and recover the noise that would have generated this forecast. And it turns out that this is very simple to do. All you have to do is just run this SDE or ODE backwards in time. And then by running it again forwards, you can either exactly recover the forecast by doing it deterministically, or generate variations of your forecast by doing this in a stochastic fashion. And so the way we propose to use this is we start by generating our forecast from running our favorite forecasting model. And this can be a numerical one or an AI-based one. We then run the SDE backwards to get the corresponding noise for this forecast. And then we use this noise as a starting point for the forward SDE. And then we guide the sampling with this likelihood, and hopefully we end up with an approximate sample from this modified posterior here. And so I said this was very preliminary work, and this is some experiments I did earlier this week, but I wanted to make it happen in time for this, to show you this. So this here is on your left is guiding only towards Y, and on the right here is guiding both towards Y and also towards the forecast using this inversion method. And this specific example is with quite high noise and observing 25% of the pixels. And we can see if we look at this, if you see the labels from up there, you can see that, let's see, you have the ground truth here, which we're trying to track. You have the observation, and you should know that we're only observing 25% of this. You have your samples, and then you have the ensemble mean of the samples. And just visually from this, you can see that we're doing a very good job of tracking this. Similarly, if we're in a low noise regime, but at a very sparse, only 5%, we're doing an even better job compared to only using Y. And it also works with nonlinear observations. So this is an arctan, for example, where you saturate the high and the low values. And finally, also for this exponential observation case, where you can really see when you look at the posterior, we have that it's meaningful in the sense that we're accurate, where the observation model is informative, but not so accurate where it's not informative. And so to summarize this, we propose a diffusion-based data simulation scheme that uses inversion to incorporate forecast information, doesn't require retraining your diffusion prior, and works with any out-of-the-box forecasting model. And with that, I thank you for listening.
Okay, and now next we'll have Joel here, also from Linköping University, to tell us about machine learning for high-resolution regional weather forecasting. So, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, it's my pleasure to, I think, finish up this weather block that we've had here today. And I mean, we already got a great introduction to what I'll be talking about, which is high-resolution regional models. So, as we've heard so much already, there's really been this revolution on using machine learning, using AI for weather prediction. And these initial really exciting developments were for the problem of global weather forecasting. And this remains an immensely important problem even today to keep working on. But we are also interested in building regional models for a specific part of Earth. So what's the motivation for caring about the regional problem? Well, it is largely this with going to higher resolutions. And higher resolutions allows us then to better model different challenging physical processes and also to utilize different kinds of regional high-quality data sets that in turn capture these processes well. And when we think of how operational weather forecasting is done today with numerical models, that is, of course, done using global models. So the most well-known ones are probably the IFS and GFS models. But largely, operational forecasting also relies on such high-resolution regional models. So as some examples, here in the Nordic region, we have this MEPS model that's being run by the Met Co-op group, including the Swedish Met Service, SMHI. So that runs for the region that you see in the figure there. But also, as another example, there's the ICON model being run by Meteo Swiss over region in Central Europe, including Switzerland. And really, many different countries will have these kinds of high-resolution regional models that they depend on for operational forecasting. And then we have the kind of research part on top of that, researchers using such operational or such high-resolution models in order to understand different phenomena. So these are the numerical models. And now that we see all of these exciting developments in machine learning, the question is how can we use also the advancements there to build these models? And there's really a few different approaches we can take to getting such high-resolution regional forecasts. So I'd like to start with giving a little bit of an overview of different ways to tackle this problem using machine learning. So I'm going to talk a bit about stretch grid models, the concept of downscaling or super resolution, and finally limited area models. All are ways to somehow get the high-resolution regional forecast. So starting with stretch grid models, the idea here is that, well, okay, let's still run a global model, but having, for some regions, a higher resolution, and then for most of Earth still staying at a lower resolution. So then we can start from some global initial condition, and we run out our global forecast, and then in the end, typically we just actually care about this high-resolution region, so we cut this out maybe and just say that, okay, now this gave us our regional forecast. And there are some pros and cons to this. It's really nice, we just need to run one single model. But it can also be a bit challenging here because we're both solving the global forecasting problem and simulating this accurate high-resolution physics. So we need to balance the performance of the model to solve both of these tasks. And a practical consideration here can be that we need to actually store computations in memory for both the global forecasting and the regional forecasting. And memory can be a bit of a limiting factor in this domain. So another possible approach here would be the downscaling setup. And really, mostly from the AI world, we would probably call this super resolution instead. So imagine here that we have a global coarse resolution model that we run. From some initial condition, we create our global forecast. And then if we then look at our region, then it's going to be very coarse and not this high resolution details that we care about. So then we could apply a second AI model here to perform the downscaling, to try to go from this coarse representation to a high resolution forecast, really filling in all of these details that we are interested in. So this is a quite versatile and somewhat straightforward approach because it's this kind of image-to-image problem that we're used to in many situations. But a potential downside maybe is that we here must run two models, both the global forecasting one and the downscaling one. But maybe an even bigger challenge with this approach is that we can note here that as we're downscaling, increasing the resolution at each time step separately, this is not really a model that simulates the dynamics on the actual high resolution. So it means that our regional forecast we end up with in the end here might not be coherent over time, or it would be tricky to actually ensure that. So that brings me maybe to the final setup here, which is that of limited area models. And again, here we would assume we have some global model, create a global forecast at coarse resolutions, but we would also set up a model to run purely regionally, starting from a high resolution regional initial condition. and then try to actually simulate dynamics at this higher resolution. However, to do this just for the region of interest, this will not be possible for any longer time unless we know what's going on also around the region. So then we could utilize our global forecast and just extract actually the boundary information that the model would need for this and feed this together with the initial condition to our limited area model, and that way produce the forecast. So that's also a pretty flexible approach. In particular, both the limited area models and the downscaling we could use really with any global model. So as these new and improved global models come out, we can plug in the forecast from them and then somehow also get a better inputs for our regional models. Again, here we would need to run 2 models rather than 1, but at least we can do this sequentially, so we don't have to share the memory between them. So now for the rest of my talk, I'm mostly going to be talking about these limited area models and work that I've been doing in this area. But of course, many things I will say are also applicable also to these other versions of regional forecasting. So one specific approach of such limited area models is that of graph-based LAMs. And this is quite similar to the GraphCast model that Ilan introduced earlier, with this idea that we build a kind of mesh graph structure over the region that we are interested in forecasting. And this mesh graph should have a lot fewer nodes than we have grid points in our data. So operating on this mesh graph is computationally much cheaper than working at the original resolution of the data. So to perform a forecast for such a graph-based limited area model, then we are learning this function G, mapping from 2 previous time steps to the next. And this consists of this encode, process, decode setup. So what we need to do here is that we don't just need to encode our initial conditions from within the region, but also this kind of boundary information. And we encode all of this up to a representation within the mesh nodes of this graph using graph neural network layers here. And then we have some processor part of the model, and there's different ways to design this that I won't go into. But this is really also just a stack of graph neural network layers, and then finally decode back down to make the prediction within this region that we are interested in. So that's a deterministic kind of limited area model. So let's look at an example of what we can do with this. So here's some experiment where we've been building such a model for a region centered on Switzerland here. So the actual forecasting region is this red part in the middle, and then we use a pretty large boundary area in this case. And the data here is 4 years of, well, it's an operational analysis from Meteo Swiss. And then for this boundary information during training, we use this ERA 5 dataset that's been mentioned earlier. And then actually for evaluating this, we use global forecasts from the numerical IFS model to feed the regional model during evaluation. So this is a pretty high resolution model at 2.2 kilometers, and here actually taking 1 hourly time steps. And in total, we model 57 different variables, but I'm mostly just going to show some surface variables here. That's the most interesting. So this shows some example forecasts at the top of the 2-meter temperature. Then we have the ground truth, the forecast from the numerical model, as well as from the machine learning model. And then at the bottom, we have a forecast of solar radiation. And this is a pretty interesting variable because so you can see that the machine learning model, it's doing something reasonable early on, but then as time goes on, this forecast kind of deteriorates. And the solar radiation is interesting because this is not a variable that's present in this boundary information. It is present in the initial condition, but the model doesn't know exactly what is moving into the area here. So it rather needs to learn this purely from correlations with other variables. We can also look at some numerical results. So this is where we evaluated this against some station observations in Switzerland. And we can see that for 2-meter temperature, the top one here, the machine learning model is fairly competitive with a numerical one up to a couple days or so. Whereas for the 10-meter wind, the machine learning model is actually achieving lower RMSE scores at all of the different lead times. But the root mean squared error here is really not telling the full story, and we've already heard this, that like actually evaluating the machine learning weather models requires us to look at many different metrics and many different properties. So we look at the frequency spectra of the spatial frequencies actually present in the machine learning forecasts here. We can see that for the 10-meter wind, there's actually quite a gap between the energy at the higher frequencies, meaning that we have this kind of smoothing effect, again, from the deterministic forecasting model. So that's maybe unsurprisingly going to bring us again to the concept of probabilistic and ensemble forecasting. So we already have some nice motivations for this, but really, again, here we want to not just find one deterministic mapping, f hat, we want to find a mapping from the previous states and this boundary information now to the next time step, and we want to do this probabilistically, really modeling this distribution using different kinds of deep generative models and perform ensemble forecasting. So what kind of models could we use for this in this regional setting then? Well, one alternative is that of latent variable models. So the idea here is that we introduce some latent random variable Z, and we say that this Z is supposed to represent all the stochasticity in this mapping, and then we impose a distribution over Z, and we learn some neural network mapping from samples of Z, as well as this conditional information to the forecast at the next time step. And in this work that we looked at this, we also integrated this with this kind of graph-based framework and built really a hierarchy of such graph levels, where we then integrated a random variable on the lower resolution top of this hierarchy. And then as we sample this random variable, propagate all of the information through this graph hierarchy, we produce different realizations of the atmosphere at the next time point. So here's some example forecasts coming from that model. And maybe what one can look at here in particular is the ensemble standard deviation here that shows us really the uncertainty in different features. This is for water vapor. So we can see that there's high standard deviation across the ensemble members where these different fronts are moving in. So there's uncertainty in how far things have traveled into the region. Another alternative to the latent variable models are the diffusion models. Again, coming back, this is some work headed by Erik Larsson, who's also here. And I'm not going to go over how diffusion models works now, because I think we all know that very well at this point. But really here we're then learning a diffusion model for this conditional distribution conditioned on both previous state and the boundary information. And if we look at such diffusion LAM forecast, then we can see this is humidity here, that these ensemble members really show a lot of nice small scale details. And the cost here is though higher with the diffusion model, that sampling takes a lot more compute than, for example, the latent variable model. So to wrap up, I'd like to also give a little bit of an outlook. So I've just been talking about weather here and regional models for weather, but really this kind of problem is present in a bunch of different areas, and maybe in particular in different types of Earth system modeling domains. So particularly, we could take an example such as oceanography, where we are often interested in modeling a certain body of, well, a certain sea, a certain ocean. And here we're also looking at how these kinds of approaches can be applied also in this problem, particularly the probabilistic regional models. In this case, we're working with collaborators at the University of Helsinki to consider how we can build probabilistic machine learning models for the Baltic Sea. So this has been a bit of a summary of what we can do with machine learning for high-resolution regional weather forecasting. My main references are here on the slide, and we also have an open source Python package for building these kinds of models. Thank you very much.
And for our next talk, we'll have Christian Naesseth from University of Amsterdam telling us about scalable variational inference for SDEs.
All right, thank you. And Thanks everyone for sticking around after lunch. Now, let's see. So I will give in some sense, a slightly different talk than what we heard so far. It'll be a little bit less of the science, a little bit more of the AI. But what I'm really interested in here is kind of pitching a class of model, not the one that we kind of propose, but one where we propose a very efficient way of kind of fitting these SDE models, and whether that might be useful for science, right? So we've heard a lot about generative modeling, about diffusion models, flow-based models, normalizing flows, all of this over these couple of last days. So one way of looking at that is, well, we have some kind of randomness, some entropy, we map it through some complicated neural network, and out pops a sample from our distribution, and then we want to fit that to data, right? So we heard, especially yesterday, we heard a lot of stuff when we had images, right, of gravitational lensing and all. And today we heard also a lot about time series, right, where we don't just have one image, we might have a sequence of images. And this is really the kind of setting which I am interested in this talk, where we're actually interested in time, how some underlying system evolves over time, want to learn dynamics, and we want to do that using kind of generative modeling. So the type of generative models that I'll talk mostly about today is what's called latent stochastic differential equations, or neural SDs, also known as partially observed diffusions or state space models, many different names, right? So where we have some stochastic process, CT, that is the latent variable, it evolves continuously but randomly in time, right? So a trajectory of CT is a random function across time, right? So there's no discretization there in time. It's just a continuous in time function, but random. So it's a model using a drift F and a diffusion coefficient G. These could be inspired by something you know about the system, a structure, or it could just be parameterized by neural networks. And then at certain points in time, you observe the observable X. So this could be, it could be another continuous or random variable. So we heard a lot about the weather forecasting. So you measure temperature or these kind of things, but it could also be, you have these DNA sequences where you observe now a discrete X over time, over the chain. But it can really be anything. So we have another distribution for that that's observed at, well, it could be regular time intervals, it could be irregular, you could have multiple series that that you wouldn't have to align because you can just evaluate the density of the likelihood at any point in time. Right, so this is the type of model, latent model that I imagine. So now let's take a quick look at a couple of examples of this that I just picked out. One could be a stochastic Lorentz attractor, where we have a very kind of specific structure of it is a nonlinear ODE where we add some noise. And then we might be interested in figuring out what are these random variables. We observe it at discrete times, but we know that there is some underlying process, the dynamical process in time that's doesn't live under the discrete space. Another one could be motion capture. We've put IMUs or cameras finding people, measuring them over time as they move around in a room, and for that we might not know what is the dynamics that's going on there. So maybe we want something a little bit more flexible. So here I have another example where we parameterizing it using neural network for both the drift, which is similar to velocity field, and the diffusion coefficient that modulates how much noise you add. And then you observe it at certain points in time. You might observe acceleration or position from a motion capture system. And then we'll model that using another neural network that goes to a Gaussian. So that could be one example. Another example that we heard a lot about today is the diffusion model. It actually turns out to be a special case of a latent SD that looks like this, where you have a very structured drift function that is linear in CT plus this extra score function approximation. And at the very end, at time point 1, you have the observation, you observe it with a little bit of noise, right? So you can imagine you start from noise over here, and then at the very end, you have your true observation, right? And then CT is the dimension of the number of pixels in this setting. So this all a bunch of examples of latent SDs. And so why use stochastic models? Maybe I don't need to motivate it that much, but I just put a slide in here to, well, the system might have some intrinsic noise, and SDs is a way to capture that. We might want model uncertainty, and it can certainly capture that as well. But it actually turns out, even if we have deterministic systems, sometimes adding a little bit of noise in our modeling might make the fitting easier or better as well, more robust to analyze. So the question then is, for these kind of models, how can we select the parameters data? Well, the talk was about variational inference, so that's what I'll propose to do here. So in variational inference, well, we have, ideally we would want to do some kind of maximum likelihood. So here now we have our time series, from the first to the last x ty, t1 to tn, and we want to maximize the likelihood, right? So how does variational inference do this? Well, this one is intractable. So we compute a lower bound. That's called the evidence lower bound. And it's a combination of an expected reconstruction terms, how well do we fit our data, and then we have an extra regularizer that says, well, our Q, which is the approximation to the posterior of Z given the data X, it is regularized so it can't be too far from the prior. So P here is the prior, Q is our approximation to the true posterior over trajectories. So because now it's the stochastic process, so the approximate posterior is also an SD. But this is possible to do. We know one way to do this is to just simulate numerically the SD Q and evaluate these using Monte Carlo, and then just backprop through everything. Use automatic differentiation tools that we have in PyTorch, JAX, and so on, right? But it turns out, yeah, you can do this. This has been tried. There's also adjoint methods to do it. So you compute the gradient first and rewrite that as another solution to an SD. But then you still have to numerically discretize your trajectory Z and simulate SDs, which makes it very difficult to fit these models in practice. So it requires both that we simulate an SD and discretize it, right? So this talk will focus on some of our recent work, which we call SD matching, where we come up with a way how we can do this both simulation-free and also discretization-free. So this is work by my PhD student Gregory and our collaborator Dimitri. So can we choose a specific Q so we can avoid simulation and discretization? So this is the thing that we're going to do here, and the answer turns out to be yes, but maybe let's first motivate why this might be possible. So I write down what is the divergence, the KL divergence between QMP. This is the problem, one of the problematic terms. And then it is an expectation with respect to the stochastic process, Z, and then an integration over time, right? But it turns out, well, we can actually switch integration over time and the expectation over the stochastic process because, yeah, the trajectory doesn't change depending on the time. And here we can see that, well, the integrand only depends on what CT is at time t. So it turns out, well, we actually only need the marginal distributions. So this expectation is now over the marginal distributions of the stochastic process. So if we can come up with a way where we specify an SDE where we have direct access to the marginal distributions, we can estimate this in much more efficiently. All right, so that's the kind of key idea. Let's define and start by defining the marginals that we want, and then figure out what is the SDE that let's figure out one SDE that satisfies those marginals. So the recipe is, well, we'll construct the marginals. We'll connect the time points through an ODE that has exactly the same marginals, and then extend that to a distribution of the trajectories, or the SDE. So let's see if the video works. Okay, so the problem is we start with defining the marginals of our approximate posterior SDE. So we'll do that by using a normalizing flow that depends on time t, right? So we take some Gaussian random variable, we push it through some neural network that depends on t, and that induces a sequence of marginal distribution. Oh. And then the next step is to see how we can extend that to an SDE that has exactly these marginal distributions. So to do that first, well, we have an example here where time goes there. So we have our marginal distributions. And then we make an ODE that has the same marginal distributions. So initialize randomly, and then extend that to the ODE with trajectories that are consistent. And it turns out you can find an expression also for the SDE that has exactly these marginals. So, and all of the quantities here don't need to focus on the math, but it turns out that if you choose it correctly, then this stochastic process will have exactly the marginals I specified. And this is the kind of key building block of ST matching. So let's take a look at how we can use this. So I made an argument that the scale term, the problematic term that requires simulation, well, we could rewrite that as an expectation with respect to the marginal distribution. So now we could estimate this stochastically, get an unbiased estimate of the scale divergence by first randomly sampling a time, and then sampling using this normalizing flow from that time point. So this is simulation free. We directly target the continuous evidence lower bound, just using this technique where we sample a random time and then the normalizing flow. So it turns out we really only need, for every gradient update, we really only need a single sample of the Gaussian noise and a single sample at any time slice, right? Whereas backpropping through the solver requires a lot of memory and time complexity. So if you look at this, for this Lorentz attractor, going back to that example, we see speedups of over 10x in number of iterations till convergence, but each iteration here is also 10x faster. And if we look at, if we increase the number of integration steps, it turns out that these backpropping through these solvers, it scales quite poorly with the length of the time you're integrating over. So there's like error accumulation. Whereas the matching approach looks like, empirically, we haven't verified this in practice or in theory. But it looks like it keeps stable no matter if I'm integrating over a very long time or a very short one. And we apply this to the motion capture example as well. So here, this latent SD approach is when you directly specify your drift function and do backpropping through the solver, more or less, using the adjoint method. So that one, we do comparable to this, but much, much faster. And as we'll see, here, another example, slightly more related to another small application, a toy model, where we took an inverted pendulum, we simulated data from it. So it's a two-dimensional thing with angular velocity and momentum, right? And we projected it to a video of 32 by 32 pixels, and then we wanted to learn the dynamics of this using just neural networks, and where we specified the latent dimension to be 2, but nothing else. So we didn't specify the drift, and the diffusion coefficients were completely flexible neural networks. And then we just learn what should this latent mapping be, this latent representation. And this here, we then generate data from the learn model. So if you look, we should ran this on a small experiment on a GPU, where we let the joint sensitivity method, this latent SD, train for 30 hours, and it struggled to, it kind of got the ends of the sequence, but it couldn't really capture the full dynamical motion. Whereas the SD matching approach did this in 20 minutes on the same GPU for the same setting. So, yeah, the kind of main take-home messages for this, I think these class of models are very interesting. I think they hold quite a lot of promise for all kinds of kind of modeling of dynamical systems. And I've shown briefly how we can parameterize this flow, this time-dependent latent representation to get simulation-free SD marginals to estimate and learn very flexibly, and using SD matching. And the question I have for you and for myself as well, what are maybe some of the scientific problems we can tackle using these type of methods? Thank you.
Come up. And for our final speaker in this session, before the coffee break, we'll have Max Welling from CuspAI, who will tell us about a new paradigm for scientific discovery.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for inviting, for organizing. It's been a wonderful workshop. I think I'm the last speaker except for the panel, so thanks for sticking around. Yeah, I kind of changed my talk even like maybe half an hour ago, which is the advantage of actually not having it to do through the system, but doing it here. And it's kind of in response also a little bit to the discussions that have happened. So many of the things I was planning to talk about, and I'll just rush through a little bit, have been sort of discussed ad nausea already these 2 days. And so, but some of the things that were, often asked was about uncertainty quantification. And so I wanted to spend the second half of this talk more about uncertainty quantification. And if the talk looks a little unpolished, I apologize for that. Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is, people have already called it the revolution, the paradigm shift. I think we all agree something real is happening. and it's happening rather fast. And I'll just give you my sort of view of what's happening and what's underneath what's happening. But I think if you listen to this, you'll probably, you know, if you put together all the other things that people have said, is very consistent with that. So the first part of this is when you. So I now also work with a startup, and so you visit a lot of companies, and then you figure out how do people actually do science, right? How do people actually, for instance, figure out new materials? I actually also think I'm the first one that actually talks about materials rather than maybe drugs or something like this. So my company is about material design. And so when you go to these companies, what they do typically is they, you know, if they want to come up with a new material, they read some literature. There's a whole bunch of really smart physicists and chemists which gather and talk. And then they think about the problem, they read some papers, they propose an experiment, they do the experiment, they analyze the data that's coming out of the experiments, and say, yeah, it's not quite what we want. And then they go maybe use some tools, right? So they maybe use some machine learning tools or statistical tools to analyze the data. And then they read some more in the literature and they come up, design a new experiment, and then they do that experiment. And so they iterate their way sort of to better materials. It's very slow because and expensive. And an experiment could, you know, a somewhat significant experiment could be $10,000, maybe $50,000 to run. In certain cases I've seen. And it could take up to many months to do. So I think we are at a time now that we can accelerate this process. And one of the ways in which we can accelerate it is to push as much as of the thinking that's happening and the designing that's happening into the digital domain. So build agents or build even part of the experiment that you wanted to do, you can probably already do in a computer. Literally by sort of simulating the material, the atoms of the material, you know, fluctuating them around, letting them interact with each other. It's maybe not as good as the real thing, but you get very valuable information with which you can design a new experiment with much more information, and so you have to do less experiments in the end. That's the way I view it. That's the first part. That's going from experiment to, you know, pushing more and more of the experiment into simulation. I think the second part is more important. So let's say we've already subscribed to this kind of simulation-based paradigm. So now I want to design a new drug. So here I am, I designed my first drug, and I'm simulating it in my computer. And I figure that's not a great drug because I've done computations, and before I'm doing the experiment, I can already sort of say that that's not worth actually doing the experiment. You know, it doesn't seem to have the right properties. Now you come up with the second drug. So in the old paradigm, you would then think about, okay, what is the next thing that we would do? You come up with a new design, and you do the experiment again. The experiment sort of in your computer, your computer simulation again. And now the point I want to make is that that's actually a huge waste. And the waste is because every time you spend energy, you create information. There's actually a very fundamental physical principle. When you spend energy on something, you reveal information, you reduce entropy. And if you then forget about that, you emit it as heat again back into the universe. What you should do is store the information in a big database. And so that's what we do. And we've heard Stefan at his company, Sandbox, also talk about this. You know, what you should really do is every experiment you do, every computation you do, you should store all that information. But you know, you can store it in a very unstructured way in a big database. But it's better to store it in the weights of a neural network. And that, of course, requires training, more energy consumption. But you put it in the weight of a neural network. And then once you have the neural network, you can now shortcut the simulation. You can do it by immediately predicting the properties before you actually do the simulation, and now you save energy. Or you can train machine learning force fields with which you shortcut the quantum mechanical calculation that you need to do in order to do that simulation. But anyway, you now save on energy the next time around you do that. I think that is the actual real paradigm shift that's happening. We've seen, even in this workshop already, somebody talk about particle physics, femtoseconds, picometers, and we've heard many great talks about astrophysics, the size of the universe, right? And there's all these many things in between. Not heard too many about geophysics, but definitely about weather modeling, fluid mechanics, fusion. We've heard about fusion. I'm gonna sit here very briefly because so many people already talked about it, and I'm gonna spend a little bit more time there. That's also a beautiful place because it's on the intersection between quantum mechanics and classical physics, and that's also a beautiful interplay, I would say. Okay, so this is, I can go very quickly. Many people have already said it. NVIDIA, is one of the first to come up with this forecast net, and then we had Pungo weather, we have GraphCast, and there is this very fast improvement of these models. I've personally witnessed this when I was at Microsoft. We worked a bit with the UK Met Office, and you just saw the people in a short amount of time going from skeptical, like we've been doing this for 100 years, why do you think AI is going to disrupt us, to bloody hell, this is actually working so well, we should get on this train very quickly, otherwise we're behind. And that's beautiful, I think. So at Microsoft, we also developed our own model. Ilya already mentioned it. This is called Aurora. Probably at the time, it just came out in Nature, but it is, of course, around longer than that. I think it's competitive with GraphCast, but I just understood that DeepMind has moved on. It's probably not competitive with the latest models anymore. And it is definitely, competitive with these kind of IFHRS, sort of weather forecast models. What was special about this model was that it's kind of a foundation model. It can take in many kinds of data, not just like some of these ERS data sets, but it can take on data of very different resolutions, and it combines it all into a latent space in which it then makes the predictions in the future and then decodes it back out. It also has a nice speed up, but you're no longer impressed by that. We've heard 10,000, 100,000, maybe 1 million already speed ups. Data set. So this was trained on 35 GPUs for about a month, so not too bad actually. More than 1 million hours of data. But the nice thing about this also is that we kind of showed that you can transfer a model trained for weather data to a completely different task, which is predicting air pollution, and you would have to do a little bit of fine tuning, but the representation you created is already very good. For the next task. And I think that's also some of the maybe paradigm shift that we are seeing, this idea of foundation models. You can use very different kinds of data to build representations and then fine-tune sort of to a specific task. The second topic is about molecules. I personally find molecules fascinating because almost everything is made of molecules except for maybe, 3 real physical things, like 3 forces, like gravitational force, electromagnetic forces, and 2 nuclear forces. Okay, so those are not, molecules. If you go to plasmas or high energies, okay, sure, that's also, you've ripped apart the molecules into a plasma. But, if you want to get exotic, like thoughts, maybe, that's also not particles, but all the rest is molecules, right? Even the air you breathe is made of molecules, which is incredibly fundamental. I would even say that almost underneath any problem, you will find a materials problem. And if we can handle and manipulate and understand molecules better, we can start to design new materials for new tasks. And there's many applications, and many of them are also quite key to societal problems, such as drug discovery, and the energy transition, like photovoltaics, lubricants, catalysis, nitrogen fixation. And the one I'm personally very interested in is carbon capture, which is also the reason why we started the company, because I'm personally very worried about the amount of carbon dioxide we are emitting, and we are moving the bill to our children, and that's probably not right. Okay, so a little bit about molecules, for those who don't know. So a molecule consists of little balls, which are the atoms. They are connected by bonds. which are quantum mechanical because they are typically mediated by electrons. So there's a position and a velocity for these molecules if you want to model the dynamics of it. Actually, the dynamics in principle is very simple. It's Newtonian dynamics from 1687, so it's a long time ago. But there are some complications, unfortunately. So if you want to compute the force, which of course governs the change in the velocity, that's unfortunately a quantum mechanical calculation that you have to do. And if you want to do it, it scales exponentially with the number of electrons. Very quickly, it becomes horrible. And so you need to do approximations. Now, DFT, Nobel Prizes have been given for DFT, is an efficient way to approximate that, but often not efficient enough. And then the second challenge is chaos. So even if you have all the forces, it's not so easy to evolve it very fast, very far into the future. Like the weather, this is a very chaotic process. And so you very quickly have to predict probabilities over positions and velocities rather than actual positions. The deterministic prediction is very hard. And then the final one is if you want to search through this space, the search space is absolutely gigantic. And so you have to be very smart about navigating in this space to find the materials and the molecules that you're interested in. So I'll just go over some tools which have been developed or partially developed in my lab and which are actually very important for AI for science. And the first one is symmetry. So I have a background in physics and I was delighted to see that we could apply some of the beautiful math of symmetries and symmetry groups to machine learning. So we all know that if you have a molecule and there's no gravitational field, if you move the molecule, if you rotate the molecule, things like the energy, the ground state energy, or the forces should not depend on that orientation. Well, the forces would rotate with the orientation. And that's what we call invariance or equivariance. Neural networks don't know about that. So if you give it the input positions in a certain orientation and you rotate it, it will think it's a completely new molecule, new input, and it will not know about that. And so, but it's easy to tell it that there is this symmetry. And the only thing you have to do is to satisfy this little diagram, which is if I have an input, this is not a molecule, this is a gecko, but you get the idea. So if you filter a gecko with one layer of a neural network, and then you translate that activation layer, it should be the same as first translating the gecko in the original space and then filtering that. So if you close that diagram, it's a commuting diagram, you're all good. And then there's been many ways to do that. And if you want to read about many ways to do that, there's this wonderful book written by Maurice. There's some co-authors, but all the credit basically goes to Maurice. It's part of his thesis as well. And it's all online for free. It's beautifully illustrated and it's hierarchical. So the first part is very easy to read. And then as you go deeper and deeper, it gets harder and harder. And if you make it to the end, I'll congratulate you because it's talking about vector bundles and all kinds of fancy math. But so this is important for modeling molecules because because every orientation are now not something completely new, they're all connected orientations and positions, and that means you can learn with less data. The second ingredient is graph neural networks. A graph neural network, so if you think about a convolution, it's a grid, it's a regular grid, so you can just take a filter and just slide the filter, that's easy. A graph, for every node, the number of neighbors is different, and the position and the ordering in which you kind of visit the neighbors is arbitrary. And so how do you do a convolution on a graph? Well, there is an easy solution in a way, which is message passing. I won't go into the details, but it sort of boils down to making sure that every neighbor has the same interaction to each other, but of course the state is different, but the interaction is the same, and so now you can kind of say everybody can send the same message. It doesn't depend on the order anymore. The message you send to yourself can be different, but it looks limited. It turns out it's not all that limited at all. And later models were message passing algorithms, which are actually much more general than that. And then sort of these students in MLab, they helped or developed this equivariant version of a graph neural net. So now it's a proper graph convolution, but it also has this equivariant property that if you translate and rotate the molecule, if you think of that as a molecule, everything transforms in the right way. So we call this a graph, equivariant GNN. Okay, the final part I want to talk about in this tools section is machine learning force fields, and in fact, equivariant machine learning force fields. So yeah, we've also worked on that. I didn't put the citations here, but this is now a huge field. I would say the latest ones are from Meta, UMA, and ESEN, trained on very large, hundreds of millions of DFT calculations. So, and they start being very good and almost cover all of chemistry. So they're becoming universal in some sense, and they approximate DFT. So instead of doing the DFT calculation, which is an expensive quantum mechanical approximation, you can now run this neural network much, much more efficiently. So that means that in you can now treat, the normal molecules where you did DFT are very small. On the other end of the spectrum, there is much larger materials and molecules you would have to do with classical force fields. And now in the middle, there is this machine learning force fields, which is, you can do both very, very big molecules, but get to the accuracy of, almost to the accuracy of DFT calculations. And if I would have to make a bet on a Nobel Prize, I think it's one day this would probably also become a Nobel Prize. Okay, so then the final ingredient is a generative AI. We've seen a huge number of instances of this already, these diffusion models, but maybe the one thing I want to add here is that you can generate images and videos with generative models, but you can also generate molecules with diffusion models by starting from a noisy blob of atoms and both creating the structure as well as the type of the atoms in the process of doing that. And that's actually quite useful because with that you can, for instance, generate drugs and other materials. And so to give a little bit of kind of feedback, sort of background on where that came from. So in 2013, we developed the variation autoencoder. It's a model where you start with an input distribution, which could be images. You then have a encoder distribution to go to a what we call aggregated posterior, which is basically the integral of over all the data of this encoded data points. You approximate that by the prior distribution, which is sort of an idealization of this object. And then from there, you can easily sample and generate back. So this is the decoder, and you generate things which now look like the things on the input space. So this model had one stochastic layer at the very top, and the rest was a deterministic neural net. In this paper, breakthrough paper in 2015, they realized if you put many stochastic layers, then in fact this is working much better. And that's basically the basis for diffusion models. It worked so well, you could even keep the encoder fixed. You didn't have to learn it, you would just have to learn the decoder, and that's just kind of this in the end turn into these diffusion models, which we've heard a lot about already in previous talk as well, where you have a stochastic process that corrupts your data, and you monitor the corruption process and try to denoise it in the other direction. And with that, you can generate molecules in the pockets of a protein that can act as drugs, for instance. Now, this is already pretty old work, so many people have pointed out that that's not really looking like any drug, but modern versions of this are already doing a lot better than that. Okay, so that's the first part. So the second part, I also want to talk a little bit about CuspAI, and the reason that's the startup company that we started a year ago. The reason we started this because I got very worried about this curve, which basically says that we are emitting now around 20 gigaton of CO2 a year. We have agreed with each other, but I don't know what that means anymore, to make it neutral in 2015, so we're not emitting in 2050, but if we make that, we cannot declare it success because there is then half a century or a century that we have to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at about half the rate that we're pumping it in now. So that's 10, oh no, I think it's 40 gigaton a year or something now. So it's about 20 gigaton a year now that we have to get for a century. That technology does not exist at this point at that scale. And so we need politicians to raise the price of emissions, and we need technology to lower the price of removing carbon dioxide. And so the CUSP platform that we're building is basically based on that idea, where, as I mentioned before, the typical way that people design materials is, there's some chemists, they read literature, they formulate hypotheses, they do some experiments, right? And then they analyze experiments. What we want to do is inject a lot more simulation and emulation in this process. So we have an orchestrator, which is kind of a smart agent that first reads the literature. So these are literature LLMs that go out and read all the papers out there, come up with hypotheses and think about the problem, extract data, etc. Then we have generative models that will generate candidates molecules that could potentially solve the problem. But you can generate lots and lots of them. So think about millions of those that you generate from that phase. And then there's a whole bunch of, I'd say property predictors that figure out whether the molecules that you have generated actually make any sense. And then you have a sort of a ladder of increasingly complex evaluation methods to figure out whether the molecules are any good. That creates a funnel with fewer and fewer candidates. And at the end of that funnel, there's a few left, and then you do an experiment with those. So this implements this idea that you want to push as much of the experiments to the digital domain. And then at the end, hopefully the ones you're doing experiments on look very promising. So very quickly, here's the generative process for metal organic frameworks. Metal organic frameworks are these beautiful molecules in which carbon dioxide molecules kind of sit here, and they kind of bind here to the inside, and they can remove the carbon dioxide from the air. So you remove them, and then you heat them or something, and then you release it, and then you bring them back, and then you iterate their process. So we've generated now over 500,000 of these beautiful structures, and we've analyzed them, and actually we are now also synthesizing them. The other side, which is really important, is this evaluation stack. And then there's this very interesting sort of visualization or graph, which basically says that it's a multi-scale, multi-fidelity evaluation stack. And in each one of these, so on the left-hand side are the chemistry tools that do simulation, all the way from quantum mechanics to MD simulations, particle-based simulations to the continuum methods like PDEs. And on each one of those, there is a machine learning method which have turned that into an emulator. Right? So it's a very active field. So you have quantum neural Monte Carlo methods, quantum DFT ML methods. Actually, Microsoft recently came out with Scala, I think. It's a method that actually accelerates the DFT method itself from this machine learning. Then there's these force fields which are talked about. All the way up to DFT, classical DFT methods with machine learning functionals, and of course all the methods we've seen in weather prediction and fluid dynamics. Those are also part of this sort of stack. And here's an example of what we at CUSP doing to sort of accelerate these different methods. This is what's called Grand Canonical Monte Carlo. It's a method where it's basically an MC method, Markov chain method, where the number of particles can fluctuate. So here you see a sort of a porous material, and we are throwing in little molecules, and then we wiggle them around a little bit and wait until they get stuck, bound, and then we try to push in as many as we can at a certain temperature and pressure, and then we plot these curves, which are the total loading, so the total number of molecules you can push into this particular material at a temperature and a certain pressure. And these you will then have to put into a process model which simulates the actual plant, which is doing the carbon capturing, and then you predict how good that material is. And we are accelerating this. We're putting it on GPUs, so NVIDIA will be very happy. It's actually collaboration with NVIDIA. So we're pushing this on VDUs to make sure that it runs very fast. And in the end, we'll also add sort of machine learning proposals to it. Okay, so then the second part is about this uncertainty quantification. So this is work with a single person, Dario Kosha, and later there's also Pim de Haan from CuspAI is also added. This is a brilliant student from Italy who single-handedly basically did all the work that you're going to see. And I find it interesting that that even single people can still make a big impact in my view. So it's not only have to be big corporations, but individuals can actually change a paradigm or change or do some really good work. And so this is all about uncertainty prediction. And whenever you talk about uncertainty, everybody wants good certainty prediction, by the way, right? So even in this workshop, everybody talked about we need uncertainty prediction, but surprisingly few people are working on certainty prediction. And the reason is probably because everybody is somewhat happy with ensembles. It's hard to beat ensembles, but ensembles also have a disadvantage, is that you have to train this number of models, or so you have to store them. That's memory inefficient. And if you're doing numerical simulations, you have to run, n of these. So it's actually also quite inefficient in that sense. So they're good, but they're slow and inefficient. And so we should be able to do better, in my view. And so we started this kind of project. Now, I don't have to tell you this. I mean, the first part is about autoregressive models and trying to make predictions about uncertainty predictions for autoregressive models. Now, there's, of course, PDE solving is a sort of a sequential problem. But there's also problems in molecular simulation. So you can write a molecule as a string, a smile string, and you can just think of it as a sequential problem where you're sort of sequentially predicting these code values, and from there you can actually generate a molecule. So you can also treat this as a generative models for molecules. And of course, Yun was talking about generative models for proteins and RNA and DNA, and there's also a language, and I hope that these things can also be used for that. So the idea is this, right? We don't want to just make predictions, but we want to make predictions and know how accurate they are. Because one thing that wasn't actually discussed today too much, which is, all of these things are super successful, these PDEs in weather prediction, but how can you trust them if you're starting to move outside of the training domain, right? And it's like the weather is actually changing, so we're moving into hotter weather due to climate change. So how do we know that the models we train now nicely generalize into a regime where we haven't seen any data at all? So for climate modeling, for instance, the climate scientists are not yet convinced that this is a good idea at all. And so the next step really should be uncertainty prediction. A little bit of equation. So this basically is the sequence model for a PDE. So you have a bunch of parameters, and you have the previous state, which is this image. You try to predict the next state. That's typically a normal distribution with some variance and some mean value for the next state. But for a molecule, we've looked at RNNs. So you have an RNN with a state H. That's great. So with the state H, which is a memory state, which collects all the information from the past, and your current state, and a bunch of parameters, there's an RNN that then predicts the next state H. And then from H, you apply a softmax, and that gives you the probability for the next state, given the entire history up till then. And what we will show is that this method will also work nicely for these type of models. Okay, so what is the structure of the model that we are looking at? The structure, and actually, people have already put this. Christian also put this already up. We have a product. So basically, the joint distribution over all the observations, y1, y2 to yt, and actually also joint over all the parameter sets, omega, is the product over the probability of the observation at time t given the entire history, plus the parameters at this time, times the prior over all the parameters at all the times. So basically, graphically, it's like you have an observation y, it moves to the next state, and then there's a bunch of parameters that you will need in order to model this transition probability, and they're generated from some prior distribution, and then we move to the next state. So this is very typical for Bayesian analysis, right? So we put probabilities on everything, including all the parameters. There's no learning, effectively. There's only inference. It's just you try to figure out what the posterior probability is over parameters or next state or whatever, marginalizing out everything that you're not interested in. So this is a Bayesian model for sequence models. And it's based on variational Bayes, also discussed by Christian. Variational Bayes, basically, if you like the equation, it's here, but mostly is if I have some distribution, a blue one, I'm going to try to approximate it as best as I can with an orange one within a tractable family, and I find the best one by minimizing the KL divergence between these two distributions. It turns out that's a tractable thing to do. You have to do optimization, and then you come up with your best orange distribution, which is your posterior. That's what we will be using here too. So here is how that looks like. And it's actually it looks like very similar to the model, but now instead of using this prior distribution, so we had a prior distribution here before, we now replace that by a posterior distribution, which is the distribution over these parameters given the sequence, the history before. Right? So the Q distribution, the variational posterior, is now the product over the parameter distribution given the entire history of all the observations you've seen so far. That's the only change you have to make. And then we're going to play a few tricks. So if you don't like equations, you can grab your phone and do something else. There's 2 slides with equations. It basically explains a little bit what the particular tricks is that we are using here. It's called variational dropout and local reparameterization. This is this paper we wrote quite a long time ago now. I forget how long ago, but ages ago, when we were still doing probabilistic stuff. It's kind of on the interface between probabilities and deep learning. And it basically says that instead of adding noise, we're going to multiply with noise. And that's interesting because it means that small parameters receive less noise and bigger parameters receive bigger amounts of noise because you multiply noise. The reason why we do this, I think it makes a lot of sense as well, but it makes things very tractable as well. And it's related to dropout. So the dropout paper, I guess Jeff Hinton wrote it with some of his students, I forgot, basically says, you take a neural network and you randomly kill some of the latent variables, the hidden variables there, and it will have to deal with the fact that so now and then things are gone. And that would regularize very beautifully these neural networks. We kind of make this a bit more principled by mapping it onto a Bayesian model. And it means basically that you have to multiply with noise. More importantly, he would just set a fixed dropout rate. We now learn the dropout rate. And the dropout rate can depend on the layer, it can depend on the time, it can depend on many things. It's a neural network that determines the variance of the noise that you're going to multiply with. And then finally, an important trick is we're not going to actually add noise to the parameters. It turns out you can integrate out the parameters and make the add the noise or multiply the noise on the activations. And that makes the whole thing a lot more efficient and reduces variance. So that's also a very important trick. You can find it in this paper. In the end, it all becomes very tractable. It's an efficient bound. Now that's the original paper. I want to emphasize it's much more efficient than ensembles in both training and memory. And here's the second set of equations. I'll go fast, but here's the multiplicative noise. So the parameters have a neural network alpha that's being trained that predicts the scale of the noise. This is a fixed distribution or a fixed number basically for the weights, and then you multiply by 1 plus epsilon. It turns out that the posterior have this nice form, which indeed has a kind of a Poisson character where the noise is proportional to the mean, the variance is proportional to the mean. Okay, and then for the same thing, we do another trick which basically, and this is very anti-Bayesian, but we basically say we're going to pick a prior, which is not actually the prior that I think, my personal subjective meaning about what the prior should be. But we say the prior has this particular structure. It's called an aggregated posterior in time. It depends sort of you sort of compute it. And it turns out if you use that, and it makes sense, but I'm not going to explain it now, everything computationally becomes very nice. Okay, and so that's it. You put in these things and you crank the Bayesian handle, and then you get a very good and efficient model. Okay, so that was the math. You can wake up again. So here is the application of that on a PDE. So this is an actual run of the model. So there's the red stuff is the actual solver. Barn is the mean, basically, is the prediction. But what you see is that as it's starting to deviate from the ground truth, it is also blowing up the uncertainty. But it's only doing it in places where it's actually starting to become wrong. In other places, it doesn't blow up the uncertainty. So it both depends on X as well as on T. And it's very reliable. So if we measure how well it does against ensembles, it's as good or better than ensembles. So here's some experiments on molecular generation. We compared it to LSM and SMILES LSTM, which are used for predicting, which were trained especially and developed for generating molecules. And we see that Barn actually has lower error across many of these types. It's a better validity, diversity, novelty, uniqueness, and it can create larger molecules, which sees here in the end. The last thing I want to say is about you can use exactly the same idea to force field prediction, because if you do molecular dynamics, you use these force fields. You should be using DFT, but you're using force fields, and you don't know whether you're going out of range. Maybe you're going into a part of space that you've never trained on, and so you want to know how much you can trust your machine learning force field at that point. And so the same model was applied to machine learning force field uncertainty prediction. So here's a little molecule. There is a message passing algorithm that predicts the forces. There's neural networks that make up these messages that are being passed, but then there's another neural network that that basically predicts the noise that you're going to multiply on the parameters, and that will give you a Bayesian model, and that will give you uncertainties. And so we did some experiments on that, without going into too many details. It actually does work better than on deep ensembles. But the most important thing is it's way more efficient. So the only thing you have to do is you run your normal prediction, and then you run this other neural network to add the noise, and you integrate out things, and then you make the prediction, and you get the uncertainties. So it's a much more efficient algorithm, and you can also see that the actual error prediction corresponds to the actual error in the system. I'll skip this. It's another experiment where we show that if you use this method, it works better than actually using ensembles. So the final thought then is, I think we are on the verge of a sort of paradigm shift, and absolutely AI is at the very least, I would say AI is a very useful tool for scientists that they should start to learn to use, and I know many that do. The most exciting thing is that we may get a handle on finding solutions or helping to find solutions for some of the bigger societal problems. Climate change, for instance, designing new carbon capture materials, or clean energy, better battery materials, or nuclear fusion, which is the sort of the first wall, the reactor wall, which is of course it's very hot and has lots of radiation going through it. Then environmental, like biodegradable plastics, for instance, or health, which are vaccines, drugs, antibiotics, but also things like semiconductors, better chips. We are getting to the end of Moore's law, and we need new semiconductors soon, and this will also help us design better materials for chip design. And I hope that's in time, so I'll stop there.